Assalamualaikum listeners. Before we start the show, I wanted to remind you guys of a very, very exclusive offer, which is essentially our Patreon, WhatsApp, Boys in the Cave chat that, mashallah, like, alhamdulillah, I think it's probably one of the best WhatsApp threads you can be on in history, to be honest, because like the amount of, mashallah, like knowledgeable people that are there, because we do add our guests from the show onto that chat, as well as our very insightful listeners that are Patreon members who are on the chat as well. You know, there's mashallah, very amazing discussions happen. So we have the sort of guests that we do have on the Patreon WhatsApp chat is the likes of Dr. Jonathan Brown, Asadullah Ali, Dr. Samir Mahmood, Tariq Tamar. We also have the likes of, Mohammed Taba, Mohammed Ishaq, and many, many others as well. So you definitely don't want to miss out such an opportunity. So we have even sheikhs on it, like Sheikh Omar Baloch, Sheikh Osta, for example. So you definitely don't want to miss this opportunity to be in the same chat as such wonderful thinkers and brilliant minds and the sort of discussions that we have. So if you want to be part of the inside conversations, definitely join our Patreon page, our $5 Patreon tier. Inshallah, you can join us in the WhatsApp group. So all you have to do is go patreon.com/boysinthecave. It's $5 Patreon tier. And at the same time, you're also benefiting our project to keep on going smoothly. And at the same time, also better our production quality. And inshallah, we can improve better and then think about going into video. And that can only be done through your help. So inshallah, I hope people jump onto that and look into that, and also at the same time benefit BITC. So thanks for that, and I'll get into the show inshallah. So I hope you enjoy the show. Listeners, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm your co-host Tanzim. I'm joined by my co-host Ryma Chia. Alhamdulillah, actually joined by two very special guests today. So today we have Aisha Hasan and Sarah Bellal, who are from the Qarawiyyin Project. So Aisha is the founder of the Qarawiyyin Project, pursuing her postgraduate degree in London. She is also a student of the Islamic Studies and a Quran teacher. She's been active in the community for several years, appearing on television, radio shows, and delivering talks at universities around the country. And Sarah Bellal, she's completed her undergraduate studies in political economy with a concentration in development in the Middle East and North Africa. Her interests include political theory and development economics, and she's currently based in California. So assalamu alaikum to everyone, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam.
I'm glad to have you all on today, because I've actually took notice of you guys through, especially on Twitter specifically. I guess, you've been putting your works out there, and especially sort of promoting the sort of stuff you're doing with the Qarawiyyin Project through Twitter, I assume. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, how did you guys get started, and why did you guys get started in regards to the Qarawiyyin Project, and what is the Qarawiyyin Project for those who don't know? So I don't know who wants to start off. I guess I'll start with Aisha first, and then...
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Tanzim, to you and all Boys in the Cave for having us. I think, me and Sarah have been quite excited for this episode, I think. But so the Qarawiyyin Project, to any listeners who are not aware, is an initiative, predominantly an online initiative, that was started by myself and a couple and a whole other team of sisters now, alhamdulillah, which essentially tries to elevate the voices of women in Islamic discourse. So the Qarawiyyin Project actually started in early 2017 under a different name by myself, another sister Aisha here in London, and a sister Noor in Turkey. And it was really an attempt to provide an alternative to the kind of websites that were currently catering to Muslim women. These websites that we were usually seeing were very identity focused, fashion focused, generally kind of a focus on appearance. And we wanted to discuss these things from an Islamic perspective, and perhaps we were kind of thinking of covering a wider range of topics. Alhamdulillah, that did make progress, but it was a learning process also, and we kind of started to see what worked and what didn't. And so after we met Sarah in Turkey in 2018, she, alhamdulillah, came on board the team, and we rebranded as the Qarawiyyin Project with a clearer vision of the gap that we wanted to fulfill, namely providing a safe space for Muslim women to engage in Islamic discourse and articulate issues that are really relevant to us beyond the usual women-centric topics that are important, but sometimes we are kind of boxed into a little bit. And this isn't something we'd really seen before in terms of grassroots projects, especially with the transnational element that we have. Obviously, I'm in London, Sarah is in the US, and Noor is in Turkey, and our writers are from around the world. So alhamdulillah, it's been almost 2 years since then. We have expanded our team of writers. We've launched our own podcast. We had our first event last year. And we as individuals often speak at other community events and lectures. And as you said, alhamdulillah, we've been posting on a wider range of topics, I feel now, especially on social media. And yeah, Twitter is a big one. And, you know, whilst, alhamdulillah, we are still a very small team, and our content production, I think, is relatively small to the other kinds of global initiatives that are out there, we've seen a really positive response, both in the digital world and in the real world. I think a lot of people are happy to see Muslim women discussing these issues. And to be honest, I mean, at first, this response was mostly for women-centric topics. You know, if we talk about hijab, if we talk about feminism, we see that people are like, oh yeah, we're so happy Muslim women are talking about this. But now, I mean, Sarah can say her take on this as well, but I feel like there's a growing appreciation for us as Muslim women talking about other things as well. And that's something I've been really happy to see, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, I think even like within the community, essentially, from my sort of experience, where when it comes to Muslim women talking about anything really, it always kind of, you know, the sort of box into just Muslim women issues in the community, and that's kind of where it is, which is kind of unfortunate, right? Like, you want to talk about kind of diverse topics and all that sort of stuff. But Sarah, what's been your sort of experience, I guess, with the Qarawiyyin Project and your sort of background and what your sort of goals and objectives are?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. So, by the time I had met Aisha, and like the Qarawiyyin Project had like been established already, and I think like when she recruited me to join the team, she had already started thinking about not like shifting the direction entirely, but almost like broadening the focus to include a lot more topics beyond just like the typical Muslim women topics regarding like hijab and like family, things like that. So when I had come into it, I was actually, kind of like, had been involved in my own like Muslim community locally, but it was also kind of like starved for like some, like more dynamic discourse when it comes to like things regarding, not just like, topics for like Muslim women exclusively, but definitely things like grounded in an Islamic framework. Alhamdulillah, it came around the perfect time. And then like we had a lot of conversations, about like, what topics do we want to focus on? We recognize that, we have a unique role to play in terms of Muslim women speaking for ourselves, and like roping other Muslim women into conversations that have to do like explicitly, with gender and like with, a lot of those like hot button topics. But also we feel like there's this huge gap in terms of when it comes to those topics that are like not gendered, but there's still like a huge disparity in terms of like, the type of people who are talking about them. So, and we've even like received this feedback sometimes, which is like, oh, we find it very interesting that, you talk about things that like men find more interesting. So like especially in response to, articles about like politics and economics, me and Aisha having like a shared interest in development specifically. And so we're trying to, at the same time that we're trying to like cater to an audience of, both sisters and brothers, but especially sisters that are out there who are looking for, like Islamically grounded discourse. At the same time, we're trying to create the space for sisters to participate in discussions about those topics that they, previously didn't have a lot of room to talk about. And I think there's been like a positive response in terms of that as well. But yeah.
Yeah, mashallah. One thing I wanted to bring up, because you guys actually have the same tagline as us. So I don't know if you noticed, reviving Islam.
I did notice that.
So I'm
actually, we have the addendum of women. I didn't notice this beforehand, just to clarify, but afterwards I thought, alhamdulillah, like, I think it's so important that we have lots of projects and lots of people from different communities contributing to, what our tagline is, which is, reviving Islamic discourse. There can't be too many.
Yeah, for sure. But I was just like, oh, they probably have beef with us, or something like take our ideas. No, I'm kidding. But but it's kind of centering around this sort of similar sort of approach that we sort of both have, where we want to elevate the discourse in the sense of we see, I guess, in our own communities where we're not necessarily talking about the sort of topics in a way where we should and do it the justice that it should. And I guess we notice things in our own sort of own communities where we don't sort of navigate the issues in a sort of more nuanced and academic manner. It seems very kind of basic or like sort of surface level sort of approach to issues you may people have seen on Facebook and all that sort of stuff. But I wanted to sort of ask, I think, Sarah, are you based from memory, I think in the States, right? In California, is it?
Yep.
So you were always based there, like your whole life sort of thing?
Yeah, I was born and raised here, Northern California. My parents immigrated from Algeria, but I've been in same place, same house, pretty much my whole life, alhamdulillah.
Okay, cool. Because this is brilliant in the sense that, you know, Aisha's based in UK. Me and Ryma are from Australia, so we're literally like different parts of the West. So I think a good thing to kind of talk about it is essentially also our own sort of local communities, because I think a lot of people, like for example, when I talk to some Americans, they're talking about like, I don't know, gun laws and stuff, and I'm like, dude, like this is like foreign to Australia, like in Australian Muslims. Yeah, exactly. So I guess like even though we talk about issues of the West in a, you know, sort of general sense, but we've got only specific sort of conversations to be had in terms of our own local communities. So I wanted to ask Sarah, like, what's been your sort of experience in your own sort of community in terms of the struggles that they have had? Because I guess within certain circles they'll be like, okay, look, the Muslim community in our local area is struggling with, I don't know, spirituality, and that's the reason for why, I don't know, Muslims are in a state that they are. Or they might say, look, it's because Muslims don't engage in activism or on the ground stuff, and they don't actively look to address political issues. That's why we're in the state we are. Or even like, I don't know, for example, another example that's used is like, Islamic institutions are run by board members that can't sort of navigate issues and are essentially, I don't know, doing it for their own sort of gain or whatever. So what's been your sort of experience in your sort of local communities, and how do they sort of go about things in general?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up like us being in different parts of the world. We have like the Anglophone world represented on this podcast right now. But it's actually been really helpful to have discussions with Aisha and like a lot of sisters in other countries to kind of it illuminates like what issues are you know, like that we didn't even realize were issues like in our local community. I mean, for me growing up, it was like being like, yeah, definitely involved in the Muslim community. My parents being very much involved at local masajid, and like I would say up until university, kind of like the perennial problem was just like a lot of, you know, like board politics and masajid. And here being this might be like maybe more unique to the locale, but a lot of the Muslims here that kind of like take up leadership positions are people who are very advanced in like their professional careers. So like, you know, engineers, doctors, or you know, like, yeah, generally like people from who've immigrated because they already had like you know, a really great educational background, or they came to further their education, and then these people seeing, you know, like a gap in like Muslim community institutions, and them having like some organizational experience, some like capital to invest, they go ahead and start establishing a lot of the Muslim institutions here. But then like a lot of problems come with that, where like the masjid is essentially run as you know, as like a, you know, it's just like a money pig, like, and you know, all of the conversations have to do with like profits and savings, and there's not like, you know, there a lot of the masajid just like lack a spiritual guide altogether. Like there's not even an imam. There's a lot of like fear of bringing in like a permanent you know, religious quote unquote leader. There's even masajid here who have like a religious committee that's like its own thing, as if, you know, like deen is separate from, you know, the management side of things, the finance side of things, and that you really see that manifesting. And then there's also like, it's hard to categorize like all of the local community issues under one umbrella, because I feel like, especially here, there's a lot of micro communities that are very like just separated from each other. So I can drive 20 minutes to a masjid that's like, you know, made up of people who like grew up with like totally different scholars, different understanding of, you know, like fiqh and aqidah, or like, and it's like, people are not that far from each other, but like very disconnected. I especially realized that when talking to Aisha and just comparing like, you know, compared to the Muslim community in London, especially, which is like relatively centralized. Places like East London are known for having, you know, a lot of Muslim institutions. And then in comparison, like the Muslim community in the US, it's not small, but it's super decentralized. And all these micro communities, you know, like they, whereas like if we had like, collected our power and collected our resources, we could do a lot more and we could progress a lot more quickly. Instead, they all try to like do their own thing. And with that, sometimes they bring their cultural baggage and try to just like, I don't know, just like give it a new face like in the US. Or it's just, by being like very, exclusive, they end up, kind of having that like private spirituality leaning where they're not really concerned with like American politics more broadly, or especially things like race relations in the US. So you end up seeing like a lot of tone deafness from like a lot of Muslim leaders where, they're just like completely out of touch with what's going on in the political sphere. And they're like, okay, the most like pragmatic thing for us now is to, like have good relationships with the police and the local government in order to make sure that like our masjid doesn't, I don't know, get like parking violations or whatever. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of like disunity. And I guess maybe like the one thing that I could say is like a really broad spanning issue is just lack of basic Islamic education. Like there's not even, I don't know, I maybe this is also kind of like a romanticization of like, maybe the UK Muslim community having a lot of Islamic educational institutions and people kind of like growing up with the expectation that, you attend a few Aqidah classes and a few fiqh classes by the time you're an adult. Here it's like there's like Sunday schools, but you get like a very watered down explanation of the seerah. You memorize a few surahs from like Juz Amma, and then you're given this like abstract understanding of like the Prophet ﷺ was a good person who believed in justice. And then people take that and they like, they land in their university settings and they interpret it in all sorts of ways. Yeah, I know maybe I made it seem like everything sucks here. That's not the case. There's definitely a lot of, a lot of lights in the darkness, alhamdulillah. And there are a lot of like even internationally known institutions of learning here. But it's strange in that I think places like Qalam and Zaytuna are almost more well known by Muslims in other countries than a lot of the Muslims here. So a lot of Muslims that I went to school with, that I went to university with, like have no idea where to find like Islamic knowledge, versus like a lot of my friends from the UK, from other countries as well, are like very familiar with these scholars. They know that they can take like online courses if they can't access a local teacher. So there's just like a huge disconnect. But yeah.
Interesting to add to that, because in some ways the Australian Muslim community is somewhat similar to the UK, and also similar to the US. So there, as you said, there are many connections to be drawn from in the Anglophone speaking world, because it's tying in together movements of diaspora from various countries, trying to link up and trying to find sources to fulfill that need for spirituality and living within an Islamic framework. But then factors on the ground take that in different directions. I just wanted to shout out before, I'm pretty sure this is going to get cut out, but when you said that your parents came from Algeria, I let out the biggest gasp. I muted it in time, but I was shook because I to draw like the massive distinction, I am also from Algeria, and that's the one thing to like be so panicked and overexcited about it is that is one major factor in Australia, is that the type of diaspora, at least in community development, more or less dictates how you're going to be approaching that Islamic framework. At least that's what I've seen, because recently, with, as you said, with a lot of fragmented communities, the reason that I find that they're trying to, fragment and form separate masajid is because they're basically trying to fulfill a need that was not met to begin with during the foundations of the Muslim community, right? So, being from a North African background and having a lot of friends from East Africa, and when I especially moved to Melbourne, essentially, I realized that Sydney and Melbourne almost like polar opposite in what they're trying to address and trying to focus within their own communities and masajid and in approaches in terms of scholarship. So alhamdulillah, in Sydney would lean more towards the UK in terms of resourcing for Islamic courses, scholarship. Imams regularly stop at Sydney and Melbourne, like, overseas imams, or like, before, when, events were held regularly, there would be major stops. So if you didn't have access in person and you weren't in that area, you'd have access online, that kind of thing. But the issue really pertained itself is to the lens in which they're trying to adopt this. And because, especially in Sydney, because it was traditionally based in a very strict Middle Eastern lens, like, the Mufti of Australia would be from a Middle Eastern background. It came from this mosque in an area of Sydney that is predominantly Middle Eastern. It sets the tone almost to the exclusion of all others, which is what led to this fragmentation. And, you could count that as cultural baggage. But when I moved to Melbourne and I saw the kind of issues that they're trying to address, it's almost completely different to what is trying to happen in Sydney. They also have the same access to resources, but they're trying to center it in a framework that adopts for issues concerning race, because it's predominantly East African, it's refugee background. So a lot of their work is to unpack that trauma because they're recent migrants in the past few years. And that didn't translate as well in Sydney, which is why there's a smaller East African population up here than down there. So I wanted to know Aisha's thoughts in regards to this, because, while it's well known that the UK is pretty much like the goal here, both US and Australia are trying to reach in terms of operating as a Muslim community, it also has somewhat of a reputation to also be quite narrow and rigid in its approach and doesn't allow for much flexibility in trying to unpack that. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, I think Sarah has, in all good faith, given a bit of a romanticized portrayal of the UK community. And to be fair, I probably think very well of the American community in many respects. And definitely the Australian community is something that I frequently look at, and I see posts on social media from Muslims there about events going on. And mashallah, I mean, you're saying we're the goal. I really feel we are absolutely very far from the goal. And I often look at Australia as somewhere that, as you were saying, has the best of both worlds to an extent. Obviously, I'm sure, you guys have your own problems. But I just, in terms of the UK community, I think that, alhamdulillah, what people value about the British Muslim community is that they seem to have held on to their Iman and their Islam in the face of increasing liberalization, which is usually the stereotype that people have of America, where that hasn't been as successful. But to be fair, I think that this has not necessarily translated into a vastly more Islamically educated Muslim community, and it hasn't manifested very much in general Muslim institutions. And I think that compared definitely to the US, Muslim institutions are lacking much more in terms of organization, in terms of just having a coherence, a good vision, in terms of something like funding. Muslim organizations in the UK are vastly underfunded, which is a huge comparison to the US, where, alhamdulillah, as they have a very well-off Muslim community who are more than willing to put money into masajid and into other institutions. I mean, of course, as well, we have to be careful of kind of generalization here, because while the US and the UK have similar kinds of amount of Muslims, the US is massive. It's a whole continent. And so there's got to be a lot more variation than there is in the UK. But at the same time, I think that whilst, alhamdulillah, I think what the UK perhaps has succeeded in is a greater drive towards learning ilm from Islamic traditional sources. And it's interesting, actually, because whilst that is often at institutions that are not Salafi leaning, I do credit that in some way to the Salafi movement in the UK, because I think that they did a good job of trying to connect people to evidences, to shuyukh, and really kind of having sometimes unnecessarily polemical discussions on madahib and aqidah and things like that. But it forced people to really question these things. And so people are driven to study at different institutions more so. And obviously we have in the north of England, we have the Darul Uloom Seminary from Deoband here as well. So we have that. But at the same time, I feel like, for example, our masajid are not spaces where communities gather very regularly. There's definitely some exceptions, like, for example, East London Mosque is, alhamdulillah, a hub, but generally mosques are small, they are underfunded, they are run by elders who have country and they did immensely great work, but they're not receptive to really what the community needs. And this has led to the increasing creation of third spaces, I feel, some of which I would say, Islamic institutions are a third space in that. Islamic institutions of learning. So things like As-Salam Institute, Ibrahim College, Cambridge Muslim College, Cambridge Islamic College. These are not mosques, but they're places that are run by shuyukh and by other teachers to spread the deen. And, alhamdulillah, they have a lot of people and a lot of young people studying there. So there's definitely a lot to go on in terms of making our organizations much better. And definitely, like you said, in terms of just rigidity. And I think that that's perhaps one of the problems with some of the Salafi movement, what it has caused in that people can sometimes not be as receptive to understanding the legacy of the Islamic tradition and how that resulted in the beautiful diversity of opinion that we do have in Islam, which sometimes I look at the US and I see more recognition of that. So there's definitely pros and cons, but the great thing about having these kinds of discussions and even just speaking to Sarah about it is that I feel like there's so much we can all learn from each other to try and inshallah work towards something that is the ideal. Not us right now, not us.
No, I beg to differ. I feel like because it's taken on much different form, it'd be great if we could just like hybridize what we've got, at least in like 3 separate jurisdictions. But, I always try to keep in mind that what we're trying to build in terms of, a community in the West is very much going to be operating within that structure in the West. And I always kind of think of, and I can't help but compare it to the Muslim world in general and the way that they structure their communities and the way that that's also similarly declining or facing the same issues as well. It's just that, it's a state apparatus as opposed to just a local structure that's trying to function within a secular liberal framework or secular society with separate jurisdictions. But, because of the internet and social media, I find that a lot of the issues that we're facing here are more or less magnetized or parallel to what they're also experiencing there in terms of a decline of spirituality, decline in terms of youth accessing Islamic scholarship, or the bigger, when we talk about, scholarship being politicized, or, in terms of trying to maintain relationships with state apparatus like police, local politicians, making sure that they're seen in the good, attending state parliament iftars and whatnot, having those kinds of relationships, there are much bigger consequences in the Muslim world in terms of taking up Islamic scholarship, because it can't happen in a vacuum. And we've seen, especially recently, how that's manipulated according to the state or the country that they're operating in. So there's much higher stakes to be had in terms of that. So I wanted to get into, well, at least try to take it back there. But, I always try to remember that, it's a very special privilege that we're able to think so small, like not so small, but our stakes are quite limited in terms of what could have been had we all stayed in our respective, our parents' homeland. We would probably be having a completely different conversation. But I wanted to ask what you both thought on how well you would say the Muslim community, especially the youth. I go back and forth and think, I'm like, am I still a youth? Am I not? I don't know. I feel like since I've started getting involved in this. But how well acquainted they are in terms of subject areas such as trying to strive for, greater progression for the ummah, being politically aware, and at least trying to operate in terms of achieving some kind of Islamic framework to operate in order to progress, our causes politically, quote unquote, even in their local context. Do you find that this is lacking in our respective communities? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think this is a really, really good question. And I'm obviously kind of going to speak predominantly to my context, but Sarah can kind of back me up with if she thinks it's relevant as well. I think it's interesting because I personally hear a lot about this conversation in regards to the UK context in terms of creating, first and foremost, an indigenous Islam. That British Muslims need to create an Islam that is authentic to their struggles as British people. It's not kind of the domain of Asians or Arabs to make their culture Islamic, and therefore subsequent generations that are born and raised in the UK to adopt that, to feel that they are Muslim. And I do think that there is authentic indigenization where Muslims can create cultural content and connections to other histories and British history and draw out Islamic values. And I think alhamdulillah, we see aspects of that on social media, and we see people trying to create Islamically acceptable forms of entertainment and art, and even in Islamic learning. But an issue that I have with this agenda is basically exactly your question, that very often what that serves to do is sever this ummatic link to the wider Muslim population and think about how should our political and religious imaginations really expand to tackle some of those issues. And to be honest, I think some people, they kind of not disbelieve you when you say this, but they think, you're kind of, until Muslims talk about politics, you're not going to be happy. But I think that it's not just solely a discussion about politics. This is integral to our aqidah and then how we practice Islam in our own countries. And last year, The Economist did a special report on Islam in the West. And I was working as a journalist at the time, and it kind of landed on my desk just before I was about to give a talk on this topic. And it had a great quote that I kind of quote now at all of these events and talks, because I think it really summarizes what Muslims in the West are doing. And basically, it roughly kind of says, 3 generations after their arrival in the West, Muslims are fashioning a theology for highly diverse societies and secular systems of governments in which Islam does not hold power. In short, they are building a Western Islam. And it went on to talk about the various cultural manifestations of that in terms of Muslim fashion, kind of other kinds of aesthetics. And essentially what it was trying to show was that Muslims are, incorporating aspects of their identity into what are predominantly secular structures. So we have modest fashion, but something that was started to fulfill Muslim women's basic needs is now produced through corporate capitalism that often exploits workers at the end of the value chains. But we're supposed to celebrate that as something that is, as an achievement for us as Muslims. And this is not just kind of limited to the aesthetic and the cultural aspect. I think in the UK, at the very least, in kind of my parents' generation, it was very much the idea that, we shouldn't talk about Islam, we shouldn't talk about politics in Islam, we shouldn't talk about politics at the mosque. Islamic institutions are very apolitical, and Muslims were generally focused on religiosity. But now as a community, and I think, this is kind of similar to the US, largely the Muslim community have kind of shifted to the left of the spectrum, which would be okay if there was some critical engagement with that as a political framework. If, people want to vote to achieve certain specific issues and achievements, then, we can talk about that. But I don't think there is, personally. I think there's an increasingly negative stance towards that engagement. And it's very abstract. It's kind of just like, we're in this situation and very pragmatic. We've just got to do what we've got to do. And I personally don't see that as sufficient. And I do think that having that attitude has wider implications on the rest of the Muslim world as well. There was a lecture I recently went to, which was by a professor at Oxford University, and she has done a very extensive study on Muslim institutions of learning in the West and the Muslim world. And she looked at, for example, Zaytuna College, she looked at Cambridge Muslim College, she looked at Tariq Ramadan's institute, and she also looked at traditional Islamic institutes of learning like Al-Azhar, the Diyanet in Turkey, Saudi universities, and one in the subcontinent. And then she also interviewed lots of Muslim youth in all of these countries about what are your perceptions of Islamic knowledge and Islamic engagement and the kinds of institutions that you would look to. And they found in this study that essentially the center of gravity in terms of public perception of legitimate Islamic knowledge is shifting from the Muslim world to institutions and famous scholars in the West. And this is often because some of these institutions in the Muslim world, they seem very politically compromised or out of touch, almost like what you were saying about how going into scholarship there and making those decisions, the stakes are much higher. So people are turning to Muslim figures and Muslim institutions in the West. They're producing young Muslims who are connected to the tradition, but they're also highly educated in the secular sciences. They're pursuing successful careers. But the focus of these individuals and institutions is primarily oriented on making Islam adapt to contemporary realities. And again, this is fine. Like, obviously, we're living as Muslim communities in the West. We need to tackle those issues. But very often the adaptability of Islam to the modern context is just the extent of the discourse. That makes it very small scale, very apolitical, and it has, as you said, kind of been reconciled to the dominant secular liberal nation-state paradigm. And that is then co-opted by states and social planners in trying to push Muslims towards those channels of knowledge. So it's not really even authentic anymore. It's not something stemming from Muslims themselves. So I do feel like our communities need to find more organic ways to challenge that and expand our political imaginations rather than being kind of limited to what's pragmatic or what's local and have that more global viewpoint.
Yeah, I would say here there's like, yeah.
I'll go into Sarah because I wanted to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah. What's interesting is that like, I think there's a trend here that has the same, like a similar underlying attitude to what Aisha is describing. But it manifests in like somebody in a group of people that we would consider on like a different end of the spectrum. So when it comes to this kind of like this apolitical neo-traditionalist group of Muslims and like scholars and institutions that we see popping up, I think that exists here as well. But then there's also there's a sort of reaction to that, which is Muslims here who are very much concerned with politics and especially with like social justice. And rightfully so, considering the fact that like I know we characterize the American Muslim community as like relatively wealthy, but what I meant also when I was saying that it's very divided and disjointed is that there's also pockets of like very poor, masajid, very poor Muslim communities in the inner cities. There's both like a class divide and like a very stark racial divide between these segments of the community. A lot of young Muslims are growing up, they're seeing this division, and they're seeing these like, again, these scholars who are presenting Islam as like kind of like this spiritual inward turn away from, focusing on matters of the dunya, and like with that kind of losing any concern for political issues that Muslims face, and then the material conditions that Muslims are suffering of as a result of that. So then Muslims are reacting to that and thinking, well, okay, if this is what like these, like what I don't know, they might like characterize, whether rightfully or not, as like conservatives. But if they're not going to be concerned with, social justice and politics, then we'll take up that helm. But it's coming from people who also are throwing away maybe like the good parts of what, that conservative group had, which is like this attachment to studying the traditional Islamic sciences. And so you have like the people who are taking on social justice causes often having like a very superficial Islamic identity, and not really having like, the like basic Islamic education to just guide them through that. Alhamdulillah, there have been some like efforts to like train Muslim activists to be, like Islamically literate, and I've been involved in some of those, but they're very like, they're in like elementary stages of development. But what I meant by the same underlying attitude manifesting in kind of a different group is like, again, what Aisha was talking about, kind of losing the sense of the Ummatic, losing a sense of like a transnational Muslim identity. And you see that like with this group of like social justice focused Muslims who are prioritizing like their identity as Americans over their identity as members of a global ummah, and like placing the Islamic identity as prioritizing it, and instead thinking that like, okay, there's a lot of this rhetoric of like, we are primarily responsible to the people in our locale, which is like true to an extent, but then that manifests in people saying things like, okay, we need to stop sending our sadaqah overseas, and instead invest it locally, which is like, there's like, I agree that there's like some shift that needs to take place, that like we can't ignore the needs of people suffering like in our own neighborhoods, but to think that there's like that this attachment to like quote unquote Muslims back home or Muslims in the Muslim world is like misguided. I think that's a huge problem, and that actually it's very convenient for people who want to like these like global institutions and systems of power that want to like strip Islam from like the political sphere in Muslim countries, and also like kind of like de-Islamize and secularize Muslims in the West without telling them like you can't be Muslim, but you know, you just can't be like, you can express your Muslimness in like in terms of like a cultural identity, but first and foremost, like you're an American with, you know, voting rights, and you get to participate in this democracy, and like, you know, yeah, that sort of rhetoric that basically serves to like de-Islamize these Muslims who are still very much politicized, if that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. I've just been nodding at both what you and Aisha are saying, because you're just hitting all the points. I could definitely attest to what what both of you are saying, and seeing that reflected here as well. Particularly this push to try and find, like you said, a very localized, nationalized version of Islam that's essentially toothless in being powerless and not being able to affect any change from where it's naturally trying to grow from and address issues too. We haven't seen that much of a push towards trying to make it like, you know, an Australian version of Islam per se. I don't think the political apparatus here have pushed that past, you know, haven't gotten to that point, because we're still very much in the phase of, you know, as with everywhere else, like, you know, de-radicalization programs, countering violent extremism. Like, the conversation is still very much there, and it's very surface level in terms of really trying to put forward any kind of argument as to how this is supposed to be implemented. But thankfully, there is still very much this connection, or there's this very much this big idea, especially among the youth, of trying to connect to a globalized ummah, which hasn't been lost as of yet, because I think in comparison to the UK and the US, we're still very much a young population. We're all still first generation, so those ties back home are still strong. They have not been disconnected in any way, shape, or form. We have yet to see that's probably in the next generation or so, but though that need to create that is very much alive and well. But what we have seen in Australia, at least in the past couple of decades, post 9/11, is that there has been this concerted effort to try and politicize Islam in terms of active engagement on the ground, but that has taken on different forms, and that mostly either has been getting into politics as a quote unquote Muslim MP, both at the state and maybe recently in the last couple of years at the federal level. But in terms of grassroots efforts, the principles of engagement have very much been localized by groups such as HT. And there was a period of time, I reckon maybe early to mid, maybe like 2015, 2016, it kind of faded away in terms of influence. But they were really striking while the knife was hot during, you know, visiting MSAs and basically trying to dictate or at least put forward their idea of the principles of engagement in dealing with politics in Australia. And that's very much, it was very much don't engage, or if you are going to engage, the only way we can engage is within the Islamic framework of a khalifa or a khilafa, and that has to happen here. And I'm like, bro, how are you going to talk about this? We want to establish a khalifa in Sydney. Please go back home and try and do that first. Like, come on. Like, I don't understand how this is going to actually work properly. Like, you know, you're talking to guys who are like playing FIFA video games. Their next, you know, their biggest concern is trying to pass this assignment and hopefully get married. Or like, you know, with girls, they, you know, their main issue is trying to get more representation in the mosque, not being siloed to women's issues, like, you know, and, you know, wanting to talk about issues like domestic violence, sexual assault, treatment of women, because that's the main thing that they're seeing. And you're over here trying to establish something that big. I really didn't understand, or, you know, I appreciate what was trying to happen at the time in terms of what they were trying to achieve, but the execution just flopped or just failed. And I noticed that, Sarah, you specifically wrote about this in terms of navigating political navigating dissent and the principles of political engagement. So I wanted to hear more about that and what your thoughts were in terms of, groups such as HT or those similar within your neighborhoods, basically trying to navigate these certain issues, and whether that principle was really the best at the time.
Really interesting that you directed this question to me, because as you were speaking, I was like, this is very much like an Australia UK thing, that like you actually have groups that are actively, thinking about like whether it's like really, misguidedly idealistic or not, but thinking about like apolitical Islam or a space political or like Islamic governance. Versus here when like Muslims are talking about like, engaging politically, it's either a turn away from politics altogether and a focus on spirituality, like I mentioned, or it's, it's just engagement, like, through the democratic process, and not really seeing any issues with that from an Islamic standpoint, not seeing any disconnect between, and I think it stems from like just like a huge lack of knowledge regarding any Islamic political principles, and this understanding of Islam being, just kind of something that guides like maybe my relationships, the fact that I have to pray 5 times a day and fast. But Islam doesn't say anything about like, what system of government to have. And this is like, I think like the general sentiment. And I think that when it comes to like articulating a political Islam here, it's not that there were never any groups that were engaged in that. But I think it really kind of got like, just like suffocated through like the state security apparatus, especially, following 9/11. And I think that now people associate a lot of those sentiments talking about like a political Islam or a political engagement from an Islamic standpoint with, like the Ikhwanis who came, maybe like in the 80s and the 90s, who established a lot of institutions, but then right after 9/11, they like dropped a lot of that rhetoric that was like overtly political, that was, what would now be considered radical, and just focused on, they like totally shifted the focus to, we just want to establish like educational institutions. We want to participate politically. We want to, do charity in our like local neighborhoods and all these things. So I understand that like a lot of why that rhetoric has disappeared is because people have like very real fears, and like communities have been targeted by like surveillance efforts. We have like CVE is ramping up now as well. And I don't know, I still wonder, I guess it's not really like my place to try to judge like the actions of these people who, a lot of whom like immigrated from countries where they had like much more terrifying state security apparatuses, and who had like, they faced a very real fear of potentially saying something that could get them or their family member locked up. And then them coming here and then like facing that threat again, even if it's like a much, it's not as big of a threat, but like kind of being very sensitive to that and being much more scared of like facing the same thing here, and then like reeling back all of that rhetoric. The reason I say like I don't know if I really understand it is because like when I talk to Aisha about Prevent in the UK, I feel like that's such it's like a much more aggressive like counterterrorism program. And by counterterrorism, obviously we're recognizing the fact that they're not actually countering terrorism. They're targeting like regular everyday Muslims who just like believe in the Sharia. But yeah, versus like, but in the UK, you still have activity from groups like HT, and you still have like a lot more of this rhetoric about like, Khilafah, and things like that. Versus here, like I had not heard Khilafah discussed as like a political institution that we need to revive until I got to university and I started talking to people outside of the US. Like, it wasn't even a concept. But yeah, Aisha, I don't know if you think that that's like, if I'm drawing a fair comparison between like UK and Australia, and then, yeah.
No, I think you are a bit. At the same time, I don't know, Sarah, I think you've had a very romantic image of the UK after talking to me so much. But I think that, no, alhamdulillah, I think there is an awareness, definitely more so than the US, of things like Khilafah, of the idea of Islamic governance. And I think that, alhamdulillah, we have reached a point where the Muslim community, if you tell them, ultimately, yeah, Islam is the solution to these things. And, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Khulafa Rashidun who came after him, you know, the principles and the ethics that we need to guide society are there, and we should be able to derive those lessons for kind of broader statecraft. I don't think people would contradict that, but I think nobody is that interested in that anymore. And I think that is a shame, because whether or not you ascribe to any particular group, I think this is a responsibility that we as the Ummah should try and fulfill. Not to say that our own local problems are not also incredibly important, but, you know, this is something that has multifaceted issues as well, and has issues and has relevance to issues, smaller issues that are affecting us directly. So, I mean, this is something that very often comes up with regards to women and the lack of you know, when we look at the Islamic tradition and we see, you know, disparities between men and women and the rights that they are given, and, you know, how they're therefore women supposed to deal with situations of abuse and domestic violence and things like that. Islamically, the point of a qadi who is there to legislate the Sharia and act as a judge in these disputes is there to provide security for women. So when we talk about domestic violence, obviously it's a different context here in the West, but even in the Muslim world or situations that our families back home are in, we can't disconnect that from the fact that there is a system of governance in a nation state that has co-opted Islamic rhetoric, but hasn't actually co-opted the Islamic rights and obligations that people are due. So I'm not saying that obviously, you know, we just focus entirely on that. I think we need to have people focusing on multiple different things, and our communities are facing a lot of challenges. But again, that's why I feel like sometimes people are talking about politics. You know, they are talking about the politics of this country, and they sometimes are talking about the politics of other countries. We need to just expand our imaginations a little bit more to think about how does Islam play a role in that. And we should try and craft that vision. Even if it seems unrealistic at first, because it's not a think about what us as individuals can achieve or what seems realistic to us, but take kind of a long view of history and see that, inshallah, in the future, where times of change come in different places in the world, people are able to act on those ideas and those principles to get in a better place for Muslims the world over. So yeah, I don't feel like it's a completely kind of acceptable thing to talk about still in the UK, but I've heard of situations in the US where people mention the word khilafah and people just like literally physically move away, they run away. I don't think that would happen in the UK. I think people would just be like, oh yeah, khilafah, lol, and kind of make a joke about it, even though, you know, they do know, of course, that Islam, you know, has something to say about these situations.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely paralleling what's happening here. Not that, you know, obviously the whole concept and framework of khilafah is there, and that is probably the ultimate goal for many. But like you said, the way that is supposed to be implemented when we're so fragmented, not only in the Muslim world, but within our own communities, makes it difficult to navigate. But even just getting to the whole conversation, I feel like we've just arrived in Australia for getting to the whole conversation of saying that Islam is not apolitical. And let me break down the ways in which Islam is not only political, but has certain position with regards to issues and facets of society that should be operating, is somewhat revolutionary at this point, because we're trying to, you know, that is deemed too radical here. Like there was just, you know, there's this concerted effort within, well, at least within here, but particularly in Melbourne, what I've seen with Muslim youth is that they're really trying to find these kinds of answers, because they do want to engage with the politics, especially when it applies to them specifically. To give you context, a lot of the issues, especially with the state apparatus, that could only be solved with political engagement, have been very much racialized. So in Australia, there was no problem in racializing the police force when it came to engaging with certain communities. Nowhere near the level as prevent, because that is just terrifying. And when I was keeping tabs on the whole development, when a lot of these social media platforms that were made that were geared towards, you know, trying to engage with Muslim youth via social justice were just part of a wider instrument, that just blew my mind. That was insane. But my relevant example is the racialization of the police force. So here in Australia, there's a very long history of doing that with Indigenous people, basically from the inception of Australia. it has always been racialized to the detriment of Indigenous Australians with deaths in custody and whatnot. And that's a very big issue that the Muslim community has taken up because of the position of trying to ally both with Indigenous Australians, but also because there's a growing Muslim population within Indigenous communities. And that's a particular facet that we're dealing with here. But towards us specifically, or as a community in general, the latest phase is currently the African Task Force. So that's predominantly being dealt with in Melbourne to try and combat African gangs, and it comes to the detriment of the Muslim community, particularly with this response. This latest response to Melbourne's second wave started out with a hard lockdown that targeted an estate or projects / like we call it housing commission, but you probably call it council estate in the UK, and the projects in the US. And there were basically 9 tower blocks that were completely shut off from the rest of society and were monitored by over 500 police officers. That was to try and combat the wave, but the wave did not start with those towers at all, but essentially just re-traumatized a whole bunch of people in that segment of our community. And that was an extension mainly through, number one, state of emergency powers, but I can't help but notice that it probably came through with that. And a lot of the criticisms and complaints from the community is that there was no one to advocate for this aspect of the Muslim community. There was no statement from our National Imams Council. We didn't see anything from the Mufti. A lot of the concerted efforts to just get them supplies and advocate for them came from their own community. Even just trying to raise awareness of how unjust this was, especially in the beginning until the media caught on and thankfully promoted that positively, that was a struggle in and of itself. And that brings me to my next point where, we're trying to navigate these really serious issues in the West, and they all take place in the political sphere. But we're either dealing with a lack of political representation, if none at all, or there are just too many divisions or groups taking different approaches on how to navigate political issues in the West. And then we just get bogged down in that discussion of who's right and who gets to speak for us. What's the actual position? There's no sense of unity. Do you feel like that is also a massive barrier, and how does that play out in your respective countries?
So I think the UK, perhaps is, I don't know how similar it is to Australia, but I often feel like we're perhaps a little bit of the ahead of the US in this respect, in that we have had, at least kind of at face value, political representation of Muslim communities for a very, very long time. I mean, the mayor of London at the moment is Muslim. We have many, many Muslim MPs. And I think that about a decade or so ago, there was definitely kind of a momentum towards getting Muslims into parliament so that they can take a positive stance on Muslim issues. To be fair, I feel like that has kind of waned a little bit. The illusion has been shattered because Muslim MPs have an absolutely terrible track record of voting against the interests of the Muslim community consistently on issues relating to things like Prevent and CVE, Israel, even Afghanistan and war and things like that. So I don't think the Muslim community now is in favor of political representation from Muslims in that sense. I think it's turned into more kind of strategic positioning on specific issues and aligning with parties and goals that fulfill those needs and those specific objectives. And that's as well often, there's a big thing every kind of time we have an election about strategic voting. So it's not even kind of voting for the party that you like, but it's voting about to keep a certain party out of power. So that could be a different party that you don't particularly support, but at least it's kind of getting the Conservatives that they're not going to get that seat then. So I think in terms of that route, I don't see much happening there. I think really, to be honest, the solution that many have to some of the political issues that Muslims are dealing with now is to build strong institutions within our community. So for things like Prevent, there is little space to challenge that in the policy sphere. There are some who do go and do engage with that, But then, for example, we have, alhamdulillah, other organizations like Cage who are very vocal about this issue and have been doing great work with communities across the UK to really empower them to recognize the signs of, your child is being watched by Prevent, or how to deal with it and how to protect yourself from it in this case, which, is surveillance of things that are perhaps just completely inane, to be quite frank. I mean, people have been reported to Prevent for saying alhamdulillah after they sneeze, or misspelling cucumber as kookaburra, like these kinds of, like children. We're talking about children here as well. And subhanAllah, it's really got to that level that I think people are really kind of looking inward to solve those problems. Similarly with the LGBT issue in schools in Birmingham, which kind of turned into a bit of an international thing. People are, the parents have been protesting for a very long time, and they're trying to create allies with certain communities that back them. Although, to be honest, there's not much allyship to be had in this respect, because I think the UK is very secular and very liberal as a society. It hasn't got the Christianized kind of element that often certain kind of conservative communities in the US have. So, I mean, I think, alhamdulillah, this seems to be a strategy. I mean, I can't say I have all of the answers either. It's definitely a dilemma, but definitely strengthening our own communities, building that internal solidarity is not a bad starting point at all.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, when it comes to, like, Muslims in the United States, we make up a very small, like, segment of the population. I think the, like, most accurate statistic is that Muslims make up 1% of the US. And we do have, like, very limited political representation. And I think that there is scope for Muslims to kind of continue what they're doing now, which is either, like, finding some political representatives that we agree with on, like, an issue by issue basis. There are certain policies that, Muslim organizations will campaign for. For example, now, like, CARE California is campaigning to mobilize the Muslim vote in favor of bringing back affirmative action. So there's scope for Muslims to, work on an issue by issue basis. But when it comes to, like, what people, I think a lot of Muslims envision, which is, like, this wave of Muslim representation in the government that's going to, solve all of our social justice issues. I think that, I mean, like, broadly, in terms of, like, a long-term vision, I don't know if the long-term vision of Muslims in, like, non-Muslim majority countries is always going to be one that is, it's like, we're in emergency mode. Like, this isn't, the place where, like, we're going to establish, again, like, khilafah. This is not, we're not in Dar al-Islam. We're not going to implement, like, the political ideals of Islam. We're going to maybe, like, get small wins here and there. We're going to have, like, maybe, like, some strategic allyships with other communities. We're going to do what we can within, like, our private institutions to, ensure the well-being of our communities. We're going to do as much dawah as we can. But I don't think there is going to be this, like, huge wave of political representation that's going to, make not only, like, improve the conditions of Muslims here, but then also improve, like, US foreign policy in the Muslim world. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like, because I know people use this rhetoric of, like, not relying on the state and not being statist, and instead working on, like, private institutions in order to improve the conditions of the Muslim community. And they kind of, the same people who use that rhetoric are ones who try to, like, depoliticize Islam and make it seem like there is no framework for Islamic governance. I disagree with that. I definitely think that there is a robust framework, and one that can manifest in different times and places. But I kind of agree with the fact that, like, if we're working on, like, improving the conditions of Muslims tomorrow, we need to be a lot more intelligent about, just building up the financial capabilities of the Muslim community here, the organizational capabilities. Because, like, here, especially compared with, like, for example, Algeria, we have so much more relative freedom to build private institutions, and to just, like, to improve our own conditions, like, and there are some, like, I guess, like, small efforts that have begun trying to do that, creating these, like, quote unquote.
You can't even establish a proper charity. Like, I'm so baffled by the whole concept that we can't even donate sadaqah if we wanted to via PayPal to Algeria because of how difficult it is to establish that without some kind of bribe or corruption. Like, it's just wild to me. So I totally concur.
No, the bureaucratic barriers there are, like, insane, and, like, that's the thing is, like, the way that people then kind of circumvent that is like, yeah, just through these like private relationships, through like literally like when we go visit, you know, or when Algerians in the diaspora go visit, they take cash with them, they give it to their families there who are like, I know somebody who lives down the street who needs this zakat. That's how we distribute zakat in Algeria, you know? But like here where we have like the freedom to create like, you know, a really well organized, professionalized institution that can collect and distribute zakats in the Muslim community, we're not doing that as much. Or we have like, the masajid here do have, you know, like zakats distribution apparatuses, but they're really like, a lot of times I don't know, they just like, they don't protect the dignity of the people that they're distributing the zakat to. It comes from like a very accusatory standpoint, or it's just badly organized. A lot of people abuse zakat funds, collect it and, you know, reuse it for things that they shouldn't be used for. So yeah, basically what the point I'm trying to make is that like we have a lot of scope to do things on a private basis, but that doesn't mean that I don't think there is like, you know, a political role for Islam.
And, you know, it also begs the question, you know, as we're having this discussion, and this often comes to my mind at times, and I'm sure, Aisha, you can relate to this specifically as, you know, well, at least within the media context, in Australia, there's been a lot of discussion about diversity and inclusion, and there are a lot of concerted efforts to try and push for that. And in the back of my mind, as, you know, all of these forums are taking place, but I just also think of, you know, we're grappling with this issue and it just seems so massive at times and the weight of it is too much. And at the end of the day, I ask myself, is it really going to be up to me, like a singular person, to try and affect this kind of change? Because it just seems like there are just these massive uphill battles, and the scope of what we need to do to just try and impact at least one issue is so massive. And that obviously takes a toll on us. You know, compassion fatigue is one thing, but from my experience with engagement with the Muslim community, or, you know, even just locally, it does take like an emotional toll on me personally because of the weight of what, you know, what you're going to say, or, you know, you're worried about whether this will have a positive or negative impact, the chain effect. You know, we're talking about people here. We sometimes think of, you know, the community is this abstract, and we're talking about these ideas in an academic lens. And I sometimes just bring it back to, you know, our families, the children that are playing playing down the street, they're playing basketball in the mosque parking lot. You know, they're actual people, and this is their actual deen and spirituality and their connection with a lot that we're trying to preserve at the end of the day. And it's just, so massive. Anyway, before I go down into a spiral of depression, I wanted to link this to specifically with Islamic scholarship, because that's where I feel a lot of the weight is emotionally draining for me personally, because I've just been saying for years that we need to come up with, at least in Australia, a cohesive structure that will financially support women who want to enter Islamic scholarship, not because of a want, it's because of a need. And this is written within our histories. I'm doing currently a 3-year course, and it's in a women-centered institution, Islamic institution, and I am just thriving off how knowledge is interpreted and presented, because all of the scholars are women. It's not only just women centered, but the way that they approach, you know, Islamic academic discourse is so fascinating. And I just felt like I am relearning everything again, purely because I did not know how many women were involved in preserving and interpreting our deen. Like, when I found out that there were female mujtahid imams, I almost fell out of my seat. I was like, this was a thing, like, and of course it would be, because Aisha radiallahu anha was one of 7 people who could give fatwa, like, you know, legal fatwas while the Prophet ﷺ was alive himself within the community. So naturally you would think that not only is this permitted but encouraged, but I'm still baffled by any time I learn about a scholar or how women have shaped discourse, research, and knowledge in this foundation. And I just mourn at the amount of talent and intelligence that we've lost in generations since, particularly since colonialism, because we did not reestablish that need to, provide growth for female scholars. And I know that you've written about this as well, Aisha. So particularly within our context, how have we fared without female scholarship? How do you think we've done? And what are your thoughts about how we should particularly address this issue within our capacity?
Yeah, subhanAllah. I mean, I think just quickly, Ryma, if you don't mind, I'll just go back to what you were saying just in the beginning of this this question as you were starting talking about just the emotional fatigue that sometimes we can feel at this immense work that we have in the Ummah. And I think just, it's definitely a very real thing to feel kind of just overwhelmed and inadequate in the face of so much to change. But I think it's always just important to remember that obviously any change, any success, any victory is always from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as long as inshallah we are making our effort and we're sincere in that, then, it's to kind of give yourself a pat on the back and just reassure yourself that this is all part of the struggle of doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end of the day. And the results, even if they're delayed, they will eventually show. But going back to your actual question now, in terms of female scholarship, I think, subhanAllah, this is something that I know in the UK is a big deal because we have a problem with Muslim women and their very presence in masajid. And I am a big believer in women being present and visible in Muslim spaces and in Muslim institutions of education and conferences and things like that. But I do just kind of want to add a little caveat here before anybody takes it out of context that I do contest the importance of representation as a paradigm. We live in an era of identity politics today, and underpinning this is the belief that by virtue of your race or your gender or your sexuality, you have a different perspective that needs to be heard. But in Islam, whilst obviously our different backgrounds grant us varied experiences, ultimately it's your value system that forms the basis of whatever you're expressing. So me as a woman talking about an issue like, halal meat is not, or the fiqh of fasting, is not necessarily going to differ from a man's perspective on that issue. But aside from that representation angle, women have to be present in our community simply because we make up 50% and actually probably a little bit more of our ummah. And primarily because the Quran and Sunnah place the responsibility of learning about the deen and enjoining the good and forbidding the evil on men and women. And then further to that, there's plenty of women-specific issues in which our perspective does make a difference, because what men are learning in theory, we live as a reality. And I'm not just talking about kind of very specific fiqh of like in kind of menstruation or something like that, which is like pretty obvious. Yeah, okay, women have something to say. But even just by virtue of being a Muslim woman in a space, we have a different perspective on that. And therefore we can, it's not necessarily going to be every issue, but we will have a broader context to add by virtue of experiencing things like motherhood and how a certain situation affects us as mothers, whereas men obviously may not have that consideration in mind. And women are not inherently like a temptation. Their very presence is not awra, and it's incredibly disappointing when some people have that perspective. We know the injunctions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to not keep women away from mosques, and the mosque being the primary community space at that time. So I really don't think it's rocket science or something reformist to think that Muslim women need to have access to communal spaces. They need to be present in our institutions of learning. We need to have access to female scholarship. And again, like, as you're saying, I've written about this, and I think that many people kind of like to attribute a lack of female scholarship as just like, oh, Muslim women are not interested. And I've seen this a lot because oftentimes people would either ask me to speak on issues at events, or they'd ask me for speaker recommendations. And when I kind of give like the same 2 or 3 people that I think would be good, they're just like, oh my God, we really need more female scholars. And I just feel like that is a very reductionist take on an issue that has very structural roots in terms of women's access to education, what kinds of education we value, and then actually giving Muslim women that space. And that was, for me, why Qarawiyyin Project was important, to provide that safe space, because I couldn't rely on other platforms to do that. And it's very easy to see, like, many of the popular Muslim platforms, again, I'm not saying they absolutely have to have women by virtue of like a kind of a 50-50 ratio, but it's incredibly disappointing where they don't have Muslim women on, or when they do, it's kind of a blogger, or I saw recently like a kind of a television presenter, or like, okay, she was a music television presenter actually. And I was just kind of like, is there no other Muslim women that you could get to come on and speak about this? And very often it's because educated Muslim women are not kind of coming, not coming forward themselves because they are ashamed, but they don't want to put themselves forward. I mean, I think something we should recognize is that many Muslim women, by virtue of being women, they're sometimes just more humble. They don't feel like they want to kind of volunteer unless somebody kind of says, I think you would be really good for this. So rather than expecting them to kind of, it's an inherently, people would consider it, I mean, this is something that I, from study of kind of gender studies, actually got this perspective where in gender studies, when they look at kind of the differences between men and women, men are the ones who go and ask for a promotion or, a bonus or something like that. Women do not. And people in the Muslim community love to kind of denounce feminism, but I'm like, okay, but this is actually something that kind of reflects reality and we could learn from. Instead of waiting for Muslim women to come and demand to be given a place, offer it to them by recognizing that by virtue of their femininity, they may not be comfortable kind of pushing themselves into that scene. So I think that it's incredibly important for us to have that link to Islamic scholarship for that reason. And we need to actively make that space. And I'm seeing kind of slow progress on that, but alhamdulillah, it's some progress.
Yeah. I would add to that just to say that, first of all, it's funny that you mentioned like how like women tend to be more humble, and we've even seen that from when we receive article submissions, we've actually received more from brothers than from sisters, even though we know a lot of sisters who are very much qualified to like speak about and write about their like fields of study, or their like personal experiences of social issues that they are really knowledgeable about. But also I think like a lot of people will hear requests for more female scholarship and wonder like Aisha was saying, like besides fiqh of menstruation, like why can't you just receive the knowledge from a male scholar? And I think that like what in my personal experience when I've and I'm not like a student of knowledge by like any stretch of the definition, but in my own journey to kind of like find teachers and find courses and just find like circles of learning, what I found is that like, I can get the knowledge that's in the books from anybody. Like they can relay that to me. I can memorize it. I can study it. But what I'm actually seeking when I'm seeking, like a circle of knowledge is that like that the social aspect and the spiritual aspect of like just being with people who remind me of Allah and people who who like help me be a better person, and people who serve as like a source of emotional healing for me. And that I really think can only take place in like gender segregated spaces to a really like, to the degree that we need it. Like you can only have a certain degree of intimacy in women's only spaces, in men's only spaces. And like, I think the movement to like integrate all of our spaces actually does a great disservice to women, because when you have an integrated Muslim space, like even if it is 50% men, 50% women, what does it actually end up looking like? It ends up looking like men speaking a lot and like taking a lot of like the decision-making power, and women doing a lot of the dirty work and making a lot of the sacrifices and doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes work. So it doesn't actually end up, like it doesn't create equal opportunity. I really do believe that, we need female scholarship, not just for the sake of, because we think that like, oh, the tafsir or the fiqh has been like riddled with patriarchy after centuries of like only males like reading the Quran or whatever, but rather that like those social spaces, those physical spaces are really necessary. And when it comes to like the difference between, for example, like a teacher of fiqh and then like a spiritual guide, is that one, the spiritual guide looks at your condition and advises you based on that. Only a woman can look at the condition that you face and the issues that you face as a woman, and advise you on that and give you religious advice on that and like teach you how to approach the issues that you're facing from an Islamic standpoint. I hope that people recognize that like when women ask for more female scholars, it's not just out of like, misandry or, like some like shallow desire for like representation, but it's out of a desire to like really come closer to Allah, and that's at the root of it.
100%. And what I found personally in engaging with female scholarship is that, as you were saying, it's not about it's not about the knowledge. The knowledge, of course, it is about the knowledge, but it's the way that it's delivered and it's tailored to your life experiences and needs that could only be intrinsically understood because of that aspect of femininity that you both share. Because it almost, not that it takes on a different form, but it does. You feel it hits you differently. You feel it, and you absorb that knowledge, and your ability to apply that in your everyday life works because of that, as opposed to mixed spaces where it essentially does default to the male perspective. And while, of course, that there are great scholars, obviously, mashallah, we've got like great access to those scholars as well. But there is that need that isn't fulfilled at the end of the day. In terms of trying to facilitate that, I feel like another barrier, apart from access to education, and what I've seen personally as well, is that there is this expectation, especially when it comes to facilitating male scholarship most of the time, is that because it's so arduous, it's intensive. It's intensive learning for a good 10, 20, 30 years. And once you do fulfill that role, you essentially belong to the community, and it's very hard to maintain that personal balance to family. And when it comes to that, the default position is that, the women in their families will maintain the household for that sake. They will probably not see much of their spouse. And that's expected of them because, he's doing a great thing in elevating this ummah, maintaining its spirituality and upkeep of its knowledge. But that is not reciprocated most of the time, if not all of the time. I can count the amount of female scholars I know on one hand in Sydney alone, and I've seen multiple attempts, but at the end of the day, she not only stops because of lack of access or lack of finances. It's because apart from being a full-time scholar, the expectation of her being a full-time mother or, a full-time wife and still being expected to maintain her household, and basically it's almost similar to the modern, the modern secular predicament of women, working full time and I can do it all. And, what mainstream, at least white feminism, tries to project in terms of, she can do it all and maintain her house and she can do it all by herself. And it's like, in reality, that it's not going to work like that. It can't work like that. It's not holistic. It's not sustainable. And that's a big struggling point, because at the end of the day, their own personal life will come in and say, we don't want you to belong to the community. You need to be here present with family. And I feel like that's the biggest barrier. There's not enough emotional support or familial support to facilitate that kind of scholarship. How do you think we should attempt to address this in the future in trying to facilitate that?
I mean, this is it's such a difficult question. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of the sheikhats that I know who are very much involved in the public sphere, and what it is that allows them to do that, to be involved in teaching after they did invest years into studying the Islamic sciences. And I think a lot of them, either they have they all have really supportive husbands and really supportive families who take on a lot of the homemaking and child rearing duties. Or they have, their husbands are also teachers of the tradition, and they work together, and their whole family is a part of that community. Their whole family belongs to the community. When they come, teach a class, their kids come to, and it's not really it's not a hindrance to their motherhood, but rather it's, they get to live with the community. And I don't know, I think maybe it's unfortunate, but a lot of brothers would feel emasculated if they had to, take on a lot of more of the household duties while their wife took center stage and was teaching to the community and everything. Getting rid of that attitude is it's not impossible. I agree with Aisha that we have to maintain a really optimistic outlook, and that Islam, doesn't allow for pessimism. It's is very much anti-pessimism and anti-cynicism. So we can work to, uproot that. But also, yeah, coming up with like more institutional solutions where if you do devote part of your life to studying and teaching, there's a lot of community members who are donating to this waqf that will like take care of you through that will take care of your family through that process. At the same time that like you're teaching, there's like a school for your kids to go to, where and a community for them to, you know, like there's programs for other kids like at the masajid that they can take part in. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe Aisha, you can add to this because like, yeah, I'm not sure what we could do.
No, I mean, I agree. I think you've said like literally what the solutions are. It's definitely a conundrum. And I think, like you were saying, Ryma, it mirrors the conundrum that women overall are facing, where many of them have to work in order to support their families. And the kinds of perennial question of can you have it all lingers. But I think that this is the thing. It's really a failure of modern societies to be able to accommodate to this shift that we've seen of kind of people working in this kind of 9-to-5 lifestyle that has kind of dominated since the Industrial Revolution almost, where increasingly nuclear families have made the support networks that people used to rely on increasingly scarce. So I think that, like Sarah's saying, it is about definitely building that support in the community that goes beyond kind of just as well the kind of just the reciprocity and kind of the networks of, yes, something like looking after your children, like that's definitely good, but definitely things like funding for people who do want to study, want to devote those years of their life to be it abroad or at home, where they don't have to worry therefore about, you know, finances, scholarship funds. I think that inshallah this is something that definitely would be really positive if we started to kind of move towards. And I see sometimes signs of that. I think like, mashallah, organizations like Rabata are doing a great job in trying to draw Muslim women into scholarship and show that this field is also for you. And hopefully we'll see people kind of come out of that and want to go into more depth and study elsewhere, and more kind of serious study to inshallah become the teachers and the leaders of tomorrow.
Totally concur, and I really do love Rabata. I do follow them on Twitter, particularly, and Dr. Tamara Gray in particular. I've learned so much from her through those limited interactions. So that is a great positive to keep in mind. And I do take the time to remind myself not to be cynical or pessimistic. That's really hard, but I'm like, no, you need to work on that, because there's an actual framework to operate on. But I would like to steer this conversation through, because we were inevitably headed in that direction. We've already touched on identity politics, the inevitability of bringing in, you know, feminism in our discourse already. And I know you've already done an episode on this, and you're probably tired of talking about it as much as I am, probably. But maybe we can just try with a little of a snapshot in terms of our perspective on it and our engagement, because I think it's gone beyond. I'm trying to push the conversation beyond, you know, simply that feminism is bad and evil and that we should not take any points from it. And I think a lot of the disengagement and the distrust, at least in Australia, comes from the perspective that it's still being viewed very much as this mainstream white liberal feminism that takes up much of the discourse in Australia, because naturally the way the population is skewed, to the way that, you know, media is represented, and to the to the cultural content that we consume, it's very much geared towards that intersectionality, and even just bringing in elements of race and experiences of different women over time has just been a recent occurrence in Australia. It's probably gone a lot longer in both the US and the UK. But, you know, as long as I do have my personal hang-ups with feminism, I don't believe in adopting labels, and there are very clear structural frameworks that are just antithetical to Islam, or we don't have the tools to critically engage, as we've seen is the general theme in this discussion. But there are some aspects of it that, you know, if you can take what's good from it and at least try to reapply to the community, whether that's actually something to be possible, only because if we're looking looking at it via a historical lens, it was the only reason, at least in my opinion, why feminist apparatus was taken up by Muslim women, particularly post-colonialism, post-revolution, is that there was this not misunderstanding, this disillusion with the state apparatus, particularly if it's supposed to be, it's classified as Muslim, but really it's just secular apparatus with Muslim culture, brought into legislation. And there was this dissatisfaction with how this was interpreted and based on really damaging and traumatic experiences with that's associated with Islam. And so therefore, in order to ascertain rights that were given by Islam, we need feminist epistemology to essentially reinforce that and ride the second wave with the rest of the world to purely for momentum and because of that period in time. I wanted to get your thoughts on how we as women should engage with that, particularly with the issues and plot twists and plot holes of identity politics in general.
Yeah, definitely. I think the word kind of feminist now is just turned into a curse word to be used at kind of anyone, women and men, who kind of express some kind of I don't even want to say non-traditional, because I think people have a very skewed idea of what the tradition is, but anything that seems to grant women some kind of rights that are similar to things that women in the West talk about. I know for a fact that Tanzim is very often written off as somebody who's been influenced by feminist ideologies because of some of the things he sometimes says about women. And even, subhanAllah, Sheikh Akram Nadwi, who is, an amazing scholar of the Indian subcontinent, he has talked about how when he goes back to India, people actually write pamphlets denouncing him as a feminist. And they start, giving this to people and other students of knowledge. And when he said this, I was like, subhanAllah, if a Sheikh Akram's stature is being written off as this, then I definitely am going to be at some point, regardless of whether that description is accurate or not. So I think I 100% agree. The discourse is very polemical and it's just not helpful. And I think, to be fair, it also shows that many people are incredibly detached from the experiences of normal Muslim women. If you meet Muslim women, real women, not social media accounts, not kind of very vocal people who have been given attention by certain media outlets. But if you meet normal Muslim women who have families, who have careers, who have interests, who have faith, but at the same time they have experienced first or second hand emotional, mental, or physical abuse that has been in some way justified by Islam, then you wouldn't be able to just write them off or kind of just say, they're feminists, therefore we're not going to take their perspective seriously. They're a Muslim at the end of the day, and you're going to want to try and engage with them. But what you're saying about kind of to what extent do we use feminism, I feel like feminism is very good at talking about some of the conditions that women have been experiencing, even if the solutions that then they give to those conditions are not what we from Islam would look at. Obviously, there's limits to that. But for example, again, when I kind of did a branch of, I guess, what would be called feminist studies in relation to economics, we read feminist studies about how the women, for example, in the workplace are perceived as less dedicated to their job, even if they work the same hours of men, the same amount of hours, because of the specific timings that they are seen in the office. So if women have to drop their kids to school and they come into work a little bit later as a result of that, even if they stay a little later in order to make up for those extra hours, because they're not seen at the same time as everyone else, people think that they are less dedicated, or, oh look, they have prioritized another role over their career, over their profession. And that then impacts how women are treated when they want to get a promotion or they want to get a pay rise or anything like that. Now, I would think that as a Muslim, looking at that situation, we'd be able to clearly state, well, this is the product of capitalism, which fundamentally values women for their monetary contribution to the economy and doesn't see motherhood as something equal to that, and therefore devalues that position. And we as Muslims, coming from a different perspective, should look at that and say, well, clearly, in Islam, motherhood is immensely valued. Therefore, we need to create a societal perception that that is not a negative thing. And we should be trying to make working life easier for mothers through flexible working, through part-time working, through distance working. And it's really interesting how, in the wake of kind of the coronavirus pandemic, everybody moved online, everybody started working from home, and people said, I saw like kind of on social media, people raising how, look at how when women wanted to work from home, or even disabled people wanted to work from home, companies' hiring policies were incredibly inflexible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it took a global pandemic for people to suddenly realize that actually this is feasible. Actually, people are working harder from home. Actually, this is more profitable. Let's keep this.
Yeah, the only way it was feasible is because men had to suddenly work from home. That I think that's the main motivation for all of this to happen, and for it to suddenly be doable and flexible is because men had to face the prospect of doing it at home. Which is baffling.
Yeah, and exactly. And pointing that out, I don't think is, something feminist, and I don't think it's something aimed at men. That is something that our society has created, where it's not recognizing the needs of women specifically, because they've made the benchmark men. And if you as women cannot, compete, and you can't fulfill and live up to that standard, then tough. And I think that Islam has something incredibly unique to offer in this regard, because it recognizes that men and women are equal spiritually, equal intellectually, but they're different because of the different roles and responsibilities that they have throughout life. And therefore, we should make allowances for that. And that's how you actually build a truly equal society, in an Islamic society. So I think that our engagement with feminism really needs to be a bit more nuanced than, oh my God, this person said they're a feminist and they're saying this. It needs to be looking at, okay, what problems are we facing? How do we address that from an Islamic perspective? And how do our Islamic solutions differ from feminist solutions? Because we should address that too. And that way, I think people will stop moving towards feminism as a solution for the problems they're experiencing.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how... Sorry, yeah. But like, the thing is, when it comes to like the type of people who are really allergic to any claims about like injustice against women that sound kind of feministy, and just kind of like, these are people who are claiming that they are like very much attached to the tradition, and as a result of that, they won't take any knowledge from outside of it. But the thing is, like, if you look at the scholars that these people claim, that's not how they operated. That's not how they wrote. They took knowledge from different sources. They engaged with writings from scholars all over the world, from non-Muslim scholars, from, like other Muslim scholars who they had like aqidah disagreements with. There wasn't this kind of like rigid understanding of like, things that are explicitly, derived from the Quran and Sunnah. Like, collecting data about the physical world can come from any scientist. It can come from any, and that's the thing, like things like feminist studies that just measure rates of, abuse against women, or like how women are perceived in the workplace and things like this. It's just a collection of data. That's not to say that statistical studies are ideologically neutral. Of course, like, choosing this, like what you choose to measure creates a certain like a system of knowledge. By choosing to measure this, then we're saying that like, okay, that's the important metric for justice or equality or tolerance or whatever. But let's say those metrics, like let's say there's no problem with them, that we don't have a problem with measuring these things. Of course, like there's no problem from an Islamic standpoint with measuring physical and like domestic abuse and poverty as things that are antithetical to the Sharia. If a non-Muslim feminist academic is measuring those things, why can't we use the data? Why can't we analyze the data and then come up with a solution to those problems from an Islamic standpoint? So that's like one thing that I think, when it comes to not just feminism, but even something like Marxism, which also very clearly antithetical to Islam in a lot of its principles, but so many neo-Marxist scholars have, analyzed the global economy. They've analyzed things like, like income disparities within nation states and then also between nation states. And they've collected that data. And now we can look at that data as Muslims and say, okay, what are the Islamic principles of political economy that will allow us to solve them? But to say like, okay, no, we're not going to read this book because a neo-Marxist wrote it, if it contains useful data, like why not? We're just, like, okay, let's say if Muslims were collecting that data themselves and analyzing it themselves, that would save us the step of having to go collect that data. But Muslims are not engaging in this, in that type of intellectual production, at least not at such a large scale. So that, the intellectual borrowing, it's not something that's foreign to our tradition. It's not foreign to past Muslim scholars, and it's not something that's inherently problematic. But I get why people are still kind of allergic to it, because you do have a lot of Muslim scholars and a lot of Muslim academics, especially in the Western Academy, who go engage with that knowledge. And instead of just taking the data, they also take all of the like underlying, ideological leanings. They accept the conclusions that that Western academics make from the data. So yeah, I get the reaction. But we as Muslims need to just be like a little bit more mature when it comes to these things, and, also a lot more compassionate when it comes to hearing out Muslim women who are saying, look, we're facing these issues. The Muslim community didn't present us with any solutions. In fact, the Muslim community gave us these problems to begin with and is worsening them for us. And then being surprised that these Muslim women are turning outside of the Muslim community for solutions. If we lack the compassion to even like bring those women in and speak to them and say, hey, we recognize that the Muslim community did you dirty and we have not provided a service for you, but like, I'm not only going to like refute the solutions that you're turning to now, I'm actually going to try to give you an alternative solution that is Islamic. If we did that, we wouldn't have waves of both men and women turning to whether it's feminism or Marxism or capitalism, whatever, to as alternatives to Islam. But if we lack the compassion to even listen to a sister who says, who uses language that, kind of marks her as a feminist, that sounds liberal, if we're just going to write her off as somebody who like hates Islam and hates the Sharia and hates the scholars, then like you're just going to make the problem worse. So there's a huge lack of, it's not even just like, there's the intellectual barrier, and then there's just the emotional barrier of not even being able to empathize with these women and to really love them for the sake of Allah. Until we really overcome that, we're not going to, like, the intellectual battle alone is not going to solve this problem. Articulating, the Islamic principles of gender justice, we can do that for days. If we don't actually address the problems that these women are facing, and if we don't do it in a way that is compassionate, that tells them, no matter what you say, no matter what labels you take, you're still my sister. It's still my responsibility to make sure that you're not being abused, that you have food on the table at the end of the day. If we don't do that, then all of that intellectual production and all this discourse is pointless. So we just have to take that additional step of, okay, we've intellectualized all day, now what are we going to do about it?
It's a bit of a tag team match, so I'm stepping in for Ryma now. But essentially, you brought up really good points, but I guess I wanted to also touch on a point that Aisha sort of made in terms of Sheikh Akram Nadwi, because it was interesting that I've actually, like, in certain circles, like, you have your traditional circles, and I guess there's circles that people are in when it comes to people who engage in academic field of studies and all that sort of stuff. And I found that a lot of people, many actually students of knowledge actually write off Sheikh Akram Nadwi based on what you're alluding to, that he's bringing in feminist ideas that are antithetical to Islam, essentially. And I guess it's kind of a shame looking from that sort of angle, because our scholars of the past, during the time of when they were engaging with the Greek philosophy, for example, they were very much engaged with it, and then for some reason now it's like that's how we sort of view knowledge that is outside sort of the traditional fiqh, aqidah, hadith, etc. And I don't know, I feel like it's sort of we've sort of separated sort of Islam in terms of what we should study and how we should sort of do things, because we sort of see every other field of science as outside of Islam, but in reality it's like Islam should be a part of every sort of field and study, right? So I guess have you found, like, what's been the sort of approach, I guess, from your perspective, because you live in sort of different contexts when it comes to, I guess, your traditional circles of learning, that are actually sort of their views when it comes to things such as feminism or even social sciences in general?
Yeah. I mean, kind of to use, just going off of your point about Sheikh Akram, I'm not here to kind of engage in a holistic defense of him as a scholar and every single one of his views, but in relation to women, the extent of his interaction with quote unquote feminism is that he has written a book about female transmitters of hadith, al-muhaddithat, and he has campaigned for the idea that Muslim women should also have access to Islamic education, in contrast to institutions in the subcontinent where even kind of madrasas, where the madrasa system that they have, they educate women to a lesser degree than their male cohorts. They literally stop at, kind of what would be considered a very basic level of understanding of Islam, because otherwise it's going to make it kind of, this is more knowledge than they need to know. They're just going to go and get married. And him suggesting that no, they should be educated to the same level as their male counterparts is what has got him this kind of smeared as a feminist now. So, subhanAllah, I mean, those two things by themselves are not contradictory to our tradition in that sense. But unfortunately, some people kind of wrestle and grasp with those kind of things. I feel like in the UK, though, that wouldn't necessarily be an issue. Like, calling for Muslim women to be educated is pretty standard. Like, that's very well known. But I think probably more problematic would be issues of things like, you know, representation or kind of female scholars appearing at events or in masajid. And so that was why I think kind of what we said and what Starima was saying in the importance of having women have access to female scholars is a really important perspective that is often missed when people just see it as, oh, you want representation of women because you don't want to listen to men. And if we say this, you're just going to kind of deny it because we're men. That's not kind of the perspective we're coming from. But I think people kind of tend to misunderstand that. But in terms of generally as well, then social sciences, I think there's a lot to unpack, I guess, just about how people perceive the importance of social sciences even. I mean, in the UK, definitely, alhamdulillah, you know, we have a disproportionate amount of Muslim doctors, which is, you know, not a problem. It's mashallah great that so many people are entering that profession, but it's often because that is seen as the profession, like that's the goals, right? And we've got a predominantly South Asian community, and, you know, if your son's a doctor, like, and even your daughter's a doctor, like, you're set, that's great. Even though, funnily enough, it doesn't necessarily pay as well as in comparison to the US, where it definitely has kind of that status. So it's kind of just an image that the sciences, and specifically kind of medicine and engineering, this is where people who are successful and are smart and have something to contribute to the community and society go. But that's very limited, and I think sometimes it results in kind of an understanding of Islam that is a little bit kind of textbook, that people kind of just, they don't want to kind of interrogate some of the theories too deeply, the underlying assumptions. And I think this is, alhamdulillah, what the social sciences does give people and why there's a lot of potential there, notwithstanding, obviously, the fact that there is a risk of people adopting foreign epistemologies and ideologies through their study of that as well.
Yeah, I think here we have like kind of the opposite problem, which is a really uncritical adoption of things like feminism. And when it comes to, I think, engagement of traditional scholars with the social sciences, there are a lot of like really good examples of, I think, them doing that in a really principled way. For example, like Dr. Sherman Jackson and Dr. Overmir Anjum, I think I would present them as like two pillars of, and just like models of doing that. And, you know, yeah, like engaging with the social sciences, using the tools of the social sciences, and still, yeah, maintaining really principled Islamic stances, and them being people who, you know, studied traditionally, what we would call like, you know, traditional Islamic education. They received that. And then also, you know, like they went really deep into like the Western Academy, got their PhDs, became professors, etc. But then you have also a wave of like Muslims in academia who are into the social sciences. And I think the biggest trend is them just kind of like adopting leftist ideals, a lot of, you know, and I think this is my like personal gripe, this being like my field of study, like in my bachelor's, which is how like capitalism and socialism have just become like these pop culture terms, and the way that they're understood in the public sphere and in mainstream discourse has very little to do with the actual definitions of these terms, with these actual theories and these systems. So instead it's become, people just have this like really vague trope of like capitalism bad, the only alternative is Marxism, thus we are Marxists. And like that is, you know, and these are like really educated Muslims, you know, these are people who, yeah, like they go through, I don't know, I guess they assume like because they have a bachelor's or a master's that they're relatively educated, but like, again, and this is, you know, this is just kind of like a global issue, I think, of like everybody thinks that they have something to say about politics and that you don't have to study it to you know, have an educated stance, but it's just like it's just like a folk conversation that we all have. But I think that like that, you know, if there was like a much, you know, deeper interrogation of like political economic systems and actual study of like, okay, what is capitalism? What are its foundations? And we would actually discover that, okay, there are different types of capitalism. We have entered a new stage of capitalism in the past few decades. And also that there are different forms of Marxism. There are different waves of neo-Marxism. And like, no matter like, you know, how many waves of and like iterations of these things you look into and you discover, we still come back to Islam as, you know, the original framework, and our original like system for solutions to, you know, these societal problems. I think that there's still, you know, it's not that I don't blame these people in the sense that I don't think that Islamic political economy, that as it pertains to our modern context, has actually been articulated in a really developed, sophisticated way. Obviously, I can't speak for like the literature in languages other than English, but in terms of like what is written in English and what has been translated, there is not a really sophisticated articulation of Islamic political economy as it would look in the 21st century. And so when Muslims are thinking about, you know, solutions to these things, they can't pick up a book and read, okay, what does Islam say about capitalism and socialism in a way that goes beyond just like kind of like the theoretical, you know, frameworks, and is actually like gives very practical guidelines for like, oh no, this is what our state would look like. This is how we would organize the economy. This is how Islam guides, you know, like the state's, relationship with like, you know, private institutions and everything. So, yeah, I guess like, we have the opposite problem here, which is like, you know, a lot of educated Muslims who are getting into the social sciences, but just kind of uncritically adopting a lot of leftist ideas.
I find it interesting. I think maybe it's another conversation to be had if capitalism does affect the way that, you know, for example, you just said that, you know, it has been articulated maybe in terms of academia of a, you know, Islamic political sort of economy in this day and age. I wonder if capitalism has a role in the sense that people are more pushed to essentially get into the fields of STEM, and then that's why we see like a sort of disconnect in other areas where it probably needs to be tackled. And I guess also touching on a previous point in terms of, I guess, the approach to feminism, like and the sort of, I guess, the Muslims and their sort of views on it in a mass scale, I guess, would you say like the likes of, let's just say, Jordan Peterson have essentially and the way they sort of portray things such as feminism has played a role in terms of how, I guess, a lot of the Muslim community do perceive ideas of feminism? Because I guess, you know, you have those kind of clickbait sort of videos, you know, feminism owned or feminist owned, I don't know, like all those kind of like random stuff, yeah, and then all the, you know, bros are like, you know what I mean? But essentially, because, like, for example, like JP, you know, I've watched a lot of his lectures, and the rabbit, like, he loves, like, for example, on the Joe Rogan podcast, he loves going down the rabbit hole of, okay, look, you know, women have more equal pay than men and this and that because, you know, less hours of all that sort of stuff, which is fine. I'm like, I don't dispute that. That's like an academic discussion, but at the same time, it's like, but his whole problematic, like his framework is problematic. Like essentially he's kind of implicitly trying to argue that the system that we are in is just, and all you need to do is work hard in order to, you know, essentially do well, which I guess there is an element of truth, but in essence the system is skewed in a lot of ways. And I guess Muslims, I don't know if they critically sort of analyze that, because the whole sort of framework is problematic, and so essentially it's not being grappled with, and they just kind of take it on face value, and that's how their sort of view of feminism is sort of defined. And I guess you can get other people, not just JP, but a lot of other, you know, figures in the world sort of go down this rabbit hole as well. But have you found that to be the case in terms of Muslims being influenced, or their perceptions of feminism being influenced by these sort of figures as well, playing a role?
Well, I'll be honest, I haven't watched a lot of Jordan Peterson, and I tend to avoid the circles in which he is credited as someone of knowledge in this discussion. But I did watch the original video that I feel like kind of got him popularity in the UK, where he was had like a discussion with this Channel 4 news presenter, and yeah, it was, you know, oh my god, he owned feminism, and really a lot of that discussion was him kind of pointing out her logical fallacies, and she got just very flustered, I think, in that discussion. And he was, you know, had a very cool, calm and collected persona. So he kind of definitely came out on top in that conversation. But I think you're right. Generally, people, when they refer to his videos, I think it's because he's bashing liberalism, right? And that is kind of what societies in the Western world are moving towards over the past few decades, and increasingly so, like, with a lot more speed in the past few years. So people want to criticize that. But yeah, they don't realize that he is doing that in defense of his own ideological underpinnings, which are also contrary to Islam. So using his defense in some certain respects, okay, they may be right, but in other respects, he's not defending, he's defending something that we as Muslims wouldn't defend. When we articulate a position, I feel like we need to stop as Muslims being very reactionary, because that's why we kind of latch on to other people's reactionary defenses of certain things. We need to stop being defensive as well, and start articulating Islam's position rather than just saying this is wrong. Because yeah, lots of people say it's wrong, but fundamentally, if the solution is at odds with Islam, we're no further to actually contributing to any kind of genuine dawah that's going to be transformative in people's lives.
I think a lot of people get their, they've developed their current view of feminism just from their parents. And I think like that existed before JP. I also have not like listened to a lot of his stuff, but I just like, I guess I'm aware of like the kind of group that associates themselves with his ideas. But I think, part of it is that I think something that Jordan Peterson has offered to a lot of men, including Muslim men, is that he talks about the issues that men face, and kind of like the emasculation of men in modern society, and how a lot of like feminist rhetoric does, really diminish like things like masculinity, and just portrays all forms of masculinity and patriarchy as like inherently negative things. And I get that like a lot of brothers are then excited to see that there's somebody out there defending them, somebody who recognizes that they also face a lot of social issues that liberalism, it creates systems that men suffer from as well. But I mean, maybe this is really unfair, and I know this is coming from a sister, so people can take it with a grain of salt. When it comes to like Muslim women turning to feminism because they don't see like traditional Muslims protecting and celebrating women, I get it. Like you kind of have to dig to really find people who are like honoring Muslim women and who are presenting all of the things in the Quran, in the Sunnah that celebrate and honor women. It's not hard for brothers to find, examples of like really honorable, beautiful masculinity in our tradition, and like in the examples and stories of our prophets and their companions, radiyallahu anhum. There's no shortage of, like masculinity being articulated from an Islamic standpoint in like a really healthy way. I guess there is like some shortage of that, and like Tanzim, you could speak to that better than I could. But it's I make less excuses for those people, if that's fair, than I do for people turning to feminism. But I think there's still there's still a host of issues that brothers uniquely face, and that need to be addressed, and that like especially here, like I think this is probably more of a US problem. We do have like a lot of spaces popping up and like talks, halaqas talking about women's issues and, misogyny, the issues that women face. A lot fewer, I think, spaces popping up to talk about like the issues that brothers face. And if at least not in like, integrated spaces where women are also listening to those conversations, maybe in their like private halaqas, brothers are having those discussions, but in like integrated, in mixed spaces, it's always like, maybe the conversation leans a lot more, towards, talking about misogyny and not talking as much about like the difficulties that men face when it comes to, just like navigating things like masculinity, understanding their role as a qawwam and all of these things. So, there's more scope to have that conversation from an Islamic standpoint, but there's no shortage of sources for us to refer to in order to have that conversation.
I want to also touch on a previous point about, I guess, the whole, because I think a lot of it stems from the sort of reading of, like, for example, I think what happens is that how some Muslims view sort of feminism and sort of Islam as like two separate categories, and then you sort of have like a sort of if you sort of quote the feminist sort of tradition, you're sort of aligned with this sort of tradition, but in reality it's not that kind of black and white, because feminist writers can write very Islamic points without necessarily adhering to the Islamic tradition when it comes to social issues, etc. But even in when it gets down to terms such as for example patriarchy, right, the dreaded word in Muslim circles, what happens is that essentially Muslim Muslims may draw to the idea that, look, in the Islamic tradition, women, there needs to be two witnesses, I guess, Muslim women when it comes to in the courts compared to men, and those kind of examples are sort of brought out in order to, I guess, justify that essentially there isn't sort of Islam is patriarchal, if that makes sense, which is weird because, like, firstly, I guess the feminist tradition, it's not like you've sort of adopted a whole set of things, right? You can kind of define things on your own terms and sort of critique and write, because there's a lot of various sort of readings of different things within the feminist literature. So to me, that just becomes more of a sort of simplistic sort of way of looking, because you can, as a Muslim, you can sort of define patriarchy in your own terms, in the sense that, look, for example, in Muslim institutions, there are certain barriers for women in order, for example, Muslim spaces become difficult to advocate for, because men are in those kind of positions of power, and they may not understand the sort of struggles that Muslim women go through, and that kind of limits, I guess, the sort of resources that Muslim women have. So that's kind of like one example, I guess, of the whole kind of word of patriarchy being defined through a Muslim, right? And and you can, there's various examples you can kind of go into it, but I guess my question to you guys is, like, essentially, what would it, how would you define patriarchy through as a Muslim? Because I guess we can both agree, like, there is patriarchy in the sense of, we're not like doing a surface rendering like, oh, Islam is patriarchal, because that's a pretty offensive thing to sort of say. It doesn't mean that Muslim women are subjugated. They may be in the way you read things, as I just gave an example in terms of courts, for example. How would you sort of approach that kind of discussion when it comes to using the word patriarchy, and as a Muslim using that term?
I mean, this is a very big question, and to be fair, I feel like this is something I may not articulate kind of as eloquently as I'd like to, but I feel like patriarchy, as, like you said, people are defining it as different things. I personally do not see Islam as patriarchal, not because patriarchy implies that men have a higher position or have a greater degree of control in most areas or all areas of life. And I think that Islam does give men a degree of control that seems to be greater than women on occasion, but it's not entirely in their hands in terms of control over women and control over those spaces. And I think that is not negated, but compensated for, in a way, by the very high status with which women occupy, and specifically the way in which Islam associates extra responsibility with accountability. And I think that very often people consider kind of people, if a man has, a specific right, that is something that's a benefit to them. They are powerful. That is something good. But in Islam, there is this understanding that whatever responsibility you have, you're going to be accounted for on the Day of Judgment. So men having more responsibilities does not actually make life necessarily better for them. It makes them liable for more on the day in which it's most important, the most important day of all of our lives, which is Yawm al-Qiyamah. I mean, I think as well then there's often misconceptions surrounding some of the rulings which people talk about as patriarchal. So like you're talking about with two women witnesses. First of all, like the ayah that is specifically talking about this is in relation to financial contracts. So some scholars have commented that because at the time of Muhammad ﷺ, women were not really familiar with the financial lingo and terminology and, business practices, it was required that there would be two of them so that, if one of them kind of didn't remember the specifics because she was not familiar with this area, somebody else would be able to correct her. Other scholars have said that this is in order to protect women from intimidation. If women have, witnessed a murder and a woman is going to come to court and, speak against the perpetrator, then she could be kind of liable for injury. They could try and get her and attack her to stop her from from going to court or whatever. Like, this is before they had witness protection, right? And even, I believe it's Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he actually commented in regards to this issue of two women witnesses, and at his time said that this was not really implemented in court as much as it would seem, because it wasn't deemed necessary. It's not really to do with a woman's intellect being half that of a man's. So I think, again, sometimes people have a very narrow or a very literal understanding of some of these issues, which then informs them of the idea that Islam gives more rights to men, therefore men are better off, therefore it's patriarchal. I think considering it from both of those angles, Islam, I don't think it can really fall into this binary of patriarchal or matriarchal. There's situations where men have the upper hand, and there's situations where women have the upper hand by virtue of the rights that they are liable to demand for themselves. And that, ideally, state structures, obviously when we look at Islamic history, should have facilitated. I can't say that was always the case, but they should have. Those checks and balances are in place. So for me, I don't know if that answers your question in terms of how do I define patriarchy, but I feel like we need to sometimes take a step back and not view Islam through all of this terminology. But kind of, again, interrogate it a little bit, question it, and look at some of the objectives of the Sharia more broadly, which is things like equality and justice and preservation of life and wealth and all of those things that we learn about, to just get a better perspective of what Islam is actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think framing a conversation in terms of like patriarchy, it takes the priorities of like an ideology external to Islam and then boxes us into like their priorities. Whereas instead of like trying to determine whether or not Islam is patriarchal, I think it's more important to just try to assess whether people's actions are contributing to Sharia or not. And so, if somebody if we can ascertain that something is absolutely Sharia compliant, and then some non-Muslim comes and says that that's patriarchal, we don't really care, but then we have to go the additional step of being like, okay, we understand how you might think that this, this ruling on its own is unjust, but there's actually a holistic system, of, Islamic gender dynamics that it differentiates definitely between men and women, but it also creates harmony between them, and it gives them roles that complement and supplement each other. So yeah, it's, again, that's why I'm not really concerned about, whether or not we define certain things as feminist or patriarchal or whatever. It's really just like going back to the sources of Islam. Does this contravene the Sharia? Is this in line with the Sunnah? Did the Prophet ﷺ approve of this or discourage this? And do our actions, fall in line with that?
Actually, it's given me a sort of idea of another kind of topic of conversation in terms of what Aisha brought up. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah saying it's not necessarily half the intellect women. That sort of conversation is that I guess I've even seen it with Muslim kind of figures, even in when I was young, sort of growing up, like, for example, some sheikh would quote these sort of hadith about, there'll be more women than men in hell. And then sort of what happens is that they lash on to aspects about Islam and sort of portray in a misogynistic manner, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So they sort of defined things in a way where they're not seeing it though, which is really weird. Like, they're saying they're speaking from Islam and Islamic and they're quoting hadith, but really they're just perpetuating a sort of misogyny without sort of realizing it, if that makes sense. And I guess that sort of rhetoric at times is very detrimental. Like, I've actually experienced it with even my family members that are women, to other people that have actually mentioned it to me, even like in a university setting where, they've had this experience that's literally like the first thing that I guess the Sheikh talks about. And I guess, if you look deeper, it's a lot more nuanced discussion. Like, I remember, I think Sheikh Hamza Yusuf went into the whole fact that just the nature of the world population over time, there were just generally more women. So that kind of explanation sort of thing. So it's not sort of black and white, like, because they're more women in hellfire, that means that men are better than women, that kind of rhetoric. So it's a lot more nuanced, and I guess there's many different examples you can sort of bring from the Islamic tradition where sheikhs kind of or certain figures sort of latch onto in order to sort of perpetuate a sort of misogyny without realizing. Would you say like this is a common issue you guys have seen or experienced within your own sort of communities, and what's your sort of take on that sort of approach in general? And is it, how detrimental has it been in terms of, I guess, Islam?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I'm just kind of going through various incidents in my mind now that people have told me of where shuyukh have brought up things that are, and said things in ways that are not just inappropriate, but often irrelevant. Like, for example, a friend of mine was at an ISOC, University Islamic Society event, about marriage. And the sheikh said that you should always marry a woman who has people who basically comes from a large family, and you should look at her mother's kind of side of the family especially, and if her mother has like if she has a lot of siblings, and if her mother has a lot of siblings, then that shows that, you know, she's fertile enough to have a lot of children. And the sister who I was speaking to comes from has only got one other sibling, and her mother was an only child, and her grandmother was an only child, and she was sitting there thinking, so are people going to determine that I am not suitable for marriage because my mom's side of the family is quite small? And it just seemed completely irrelevant, not scientifically factual, and subhanAllah, not something that is of importance when addressing big things like marriage in our community. I had another incident recently where on Hajj in Arafah, in the men's section, so, I mean, subhanAllah, there was kind of other crazy stuff going on at that time in terms of men trying to get into the women's section and things like that. But the sheikh is sitting there, you know, this is an incredibly important day, the most special day of the year. People are supposed to be thinking about the akhirah, making dua. And the sheikh is talking about kind of various issues and then decides to do a poll of how many men would take a second wife. And the women are on the other side. They can hear this. This is part of, you know, the discussion that group that have been taken by this like Hajj agency are all in. And they were just like, what kind of a time is this to start that conversation? You know, and have all of these men put their hands up. Incredibly inappropriate. That just makes women feel like they aren't valued, their feelings are not being respected in these situations. So I think there generally needs to be like a real kind of reevaluation of when we're talking about things, we need to recognize that these are issues that are misunderstood. We need to actually talk about women's issues deliberately. And actually, subhanAllah, this is something that was a bit relevant to me because I teach at a local madrasa on the weekends, and once I teach the girls class, but once the boys class, and these are like kind of young teens, their teacher was absent, so I had to take both classes. So I kind of merged them, and the girls were on one side, the boys were on one side. As soon as like I started the class, I'm doing the seerah with my girls class, the boys started saying, oh, I don't want to take this class, we're just going to talk about ponies. And they started making comments which, you know, they're old enough to know better. These are 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds that clearly showed that they don't respect whatever the sisters are learning. They don't respect what I am necessarily teaching. And that is something that's not been fed to them by the teacher in this respect, who, you know, mashallah, was a good brother, but that's just what they've been socialized into thinking. And so I was like very disturbed by this. And they said like many other comments of kind of a similar ilk at the time. And I went to the teacher and I was like, please address this with them. And, you know, alhamdulillah, now I think in this coming year, the curriculum is trying to look at some of these issues of how do we respect women, because it's something that people are internalizing without knowing. And we do need to work on it in certain spheres. And again, that's not something feminist to say. You know, we should also work on, women respecting men, definitely. But there is a huge emphasis on that already, I think, in Muslim women's circles.
Yeah, I think this is the point in the conversation where a ton of people are going to tune out, where they hear women complaining about misogyny and they're like, oh, okay, like that's enough. Like, it's just like, you know, this is feminist complaining. And I hope that like people who think that, you know, it just goes as far as like, oh, maybe if women were less sensitive, you know, they would be able to just like, you know, hear these jokes about polygamy and like not take it so seriously. Like, you don't have to be so offended by it. But it's not like the issues that, you know, that really like screw up Muslim women's relationship with their deen. It's not a lack of ability to take jokes. And like for me, growing up, not hearing a lot of these comments about you know, of people like weaponizing, you know, hadith or the Quran against women through like misinterpretations or mistranslations, but rather I actually grew up with like pretty healthy ideas about women in Islam. All credit to my parents, who both like taught us really well and also like only really took us to community spaces where these things were articulated well. And if we heard something incorrect, like my dad was always the first one to like encourage me to, you know, you know, seek knowledge and to take positions of leadership and to, you know, like he's always been like in my corner. But then I always thought that, you know, like, oh, okay, I haven't really had this like really poisoned relationship with Islam. So you know, alhamdulillah, like I haven't really like suffered the effects of that so much. But like sometimes I see like how, you know, hearing this rhetoric sometimes is like kind of pervaded my subconscious. And this like shows up in ways like sometimes I'll be reading, you know, like a surah and I come across an ayah that says something really beautiful about women or that really honors women or honors a woman of our past, and it surprises me. And like I remember the other day, like I was reading like some ayats that were like about like Asya alayhi salam, and I was like, I don't know, I had this subconscious reaction that was like, oh wow, there's something nice about women like here in the Quran, that's so cool. And then I paused and I was like, wait, why am I surprised by this? Like, why am I pleasantly surprised? And it made me so angry to think that like that somebody has poisoned my relationship with the Quran and like my relationship with Allah by making me think that like my God, who like my creator has, you know, created me in like a diminished or like like in an inferior fashion. That really was really frustrating. And these are things that like if I didn't pause to just, you know, like think about that, then I could have, you know, just like gone on not considering like how a lot of this rhetoric, like hearing bits and pieces of it throughout the years, has affected me and has affected my relationship with Allah. But it creates a huge barrier to women's relationship with their creator. And then, you know, like we can't be surprised then when people have all sorts of like misunderstandings of Islam and eventually just drift from it. If you can't even like, if you poison their understanding of Allah, like what's worse than that? Yeah.
I guess for Muslims, for especially us living in this day and age, we don't analyze deeply the sort of ideas and notions we've just sort of inherited just purely on the basis of the society we live in. Like I guess one example is like, you know, ideas of secularism or liberalism going through the education system. If you're like primary, high school, you've just, you know, subconsciously inherited without sort of questioning. And I guess at times, you know, as a Muslim, you sort of reflect and self-reflect. You sort of interrogate those sort of assumptions that you had about even ideas to do with religion, like for example, religion just being in the private sphere, etc. I guess as a Muslim and being in the community and you start being practicing, you kind of have to undo these sort of notions when you know engage with the tradition. And I guess to take that example to, for example, misogyny, right? Like nature of the society that we're in at times, what's happened, I feel, and I guess you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, that the society is sort of men especially, like at times we may just subconsciously inherit ideas of you know misogyny, and then what happens, I guess, as when we study the tradition, we've just sort of latched onto things that sort of justify that sort of subconscious misogyny we've inherited, and it doesn't get interrogated and just gets amplified, if anything, through the examples that you mentioned, and it becomes I think a more difficult process to undo, simply because ideas of, I guess, liberalism, secularism are easily you can sort of, you know, critique, and it's propagated by a lot of the Dawah figures. They're always talking about it, etc., and essentially people are well acquainted with the ills of that when it comes to, you know, liberalism, secularism, and Islam. But I guess when it comes to ideas such as misogyny, it's not done in the same way. So then, you know, you just kind of gets it's not tackled head on, if that makes sense. So I guess let me know if you think my sort of viewpoint is correct or not. But what I wanted to also ask is like, what's your sort of suggestions as ways as a community we can sort of undo this sort of these notions of, for example, misogyny within the community on a larger scale? Because I just feel like it is sort of very embedded at times within the community. It's sort of hard to undo, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh man, how to fix misogyny in the Muslim community? I think, well, part of it is like interpersonal, right? So you just have a lot of people who grew up seeing their mothers treated a certain way or their sisters treated a certain way, and so they develop that they come to understand that as like a proper way of treating women. I guess the way to combat that is, you know, when it comes to like choosing our friends and choosing our teachers, we have to, you know, there's a way to like have professional, intentional relationships with people of the opposite gender and to learn from them, without, you know, like crossing the boundaries of like free mixing and all of that. So like having teachers of the opposite gender, for both men and women is really important, and having teachers that, you know, that like if you have for example, a brother, if you have a teacher or a friend or a da'i that you listen to and you realize that there's like a huge lack of women in his audiences or in his followership, or that he does make a lot of like these like small jabs at women, then, you know, maybe you're not as sensitive to them as a lot of sisters, but kind of just like, you know, assess the audience and think like, okay, why am I comfortable listening to this guy, but none of my sisters are? And that kind of like, you know, by giving platforms to certain people and not giving platforms to other people, you know, we can just like improve the like our communal discourse, improve our relationships that way. But yeah, I mean, as like Salafi as it sounds, like turning back to the Quran and Sunnah and just like really looking at, you know, like how gender is presented and how like women are spoken about in the Quran and Sunnah. Like, it's not that there's, you know, it's not difficult to look at our sources and see a celebration of women and to see positive notions about women. It's just a lack of looking at those sources. And what's interesting is like, yeah, it's the same people who, you know, are very critical of using like leftist liberal language, about like safe spaces and triggering and all this stuff, who are definitely using alt-right language and who are like adopting all of the, you know, all the insults that the alt-right uses that I'm not going to repeat now. They're the same people who like are like, oh, why are you taking knowledge from people who are not Muslim when it comes to gender, but they're taking knowledge from like Jordan Peterson. Like it's a huge, like, you know, a level of hypocrisy there that people just need to interrogate. And yeah, I mean, it always comes back down to like the root issues of just like a lack of taqwa, I think. And nobody wants to hear that they lack taqwa or that their iman, that there's a flaw in their iman. But if you like have a negative view of women, and if you're not sensitive to their suffering, and if you're not sensitive to their complaints, and if you're comfortable making jokes about them, and if you're comfortable, you know, being in spaces where they're treated like garbage, I think there's an issue with your taqwa. And like a lot of us need to hear that. And like it, you know, it's unfortunate, but there's so many, like, it's very clearly laid out, like how to gain taqwa. Like there's not a problem with that. So like even things like, just increasing in dhikr, you know, trying to like improve our khushu' and salah by like eating halal and like spending less time on social media. These are the things that like scholars repeat ad nauseum that we don't see as solutions to broader social problems. But really like the physical dhikr of your tongue that like keeps you conscious of Allah, like mentally and emotionally, will also influence your relationships with people. It'll influence how you see people of the opposite gender, and it makes you a more empathetic, compassionate person. It makes you a person of integrity who actually, you know, tries to judge knowledge accurately, tries to judge the sources that you're receiving knowledge from. So yeah, the same solutions that, you know, that we present to people when they ask like, oh, why are we having so many marriage issues? Why are our kids growing up and becoming bums? Like it's a lack of taqwa and a lack of, you know, like just attachment to Allah and like a flaw in people's relationship with Allah, at the very root. And so, you know, we have to address the root, and then we also have to go beyond that and be like, okay, what are the immediate practical steps for, combating these things? But, yeah, Aisha, I don't know if you have things to add.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, agreed with everything you said, and I think it's really important definitely to bring the spiritual dimension into this as well, because that's often neglected. And, you know, obviously as Muslims we are people of action, so I'm not saying that, yeah, we should just kind of work on ourselves, but oftentimes we think that working on ourselves is like not a less action, but it's kind of implied, but it needs to be stated, and it needs to be something active, not passive. So that's a huge part of it, definitely, for men and women, of course. I guess the only two things I would add would be to listen to Muslim women. I think the number one thing that I've seen of people who kind of used to have a bit more of a like judgmental or harsh stance about some things about women, what changed them was when they started interacting with people and hearing stories, or perhaps working with women who are going through difficult situations like domestic abuse, but also other things. And when they started listening, they started to appreciate that these women were not coming from a bad place, but they needed a solution to their problem. So I guess that's the first thing I would bring up. And the second thing I think that, you know, Muslims generally need to do, and this is probably going to be a bit more like controversial, but they need to actually kind of re-evaluate and re-look at the differences between Islamic gender roles and gender responsibilities and specific fiqh requirements directed at each gender, and gender stereotypes. And I think people get them mixed an awful lot, and that is where the root of a lot of kind of resentment or the idea that women are kind of, you know, feminists comes from, because if they don't see women occupying a certain stereotype, they think you're not from Islam. But that stereotype doesn't necessarily conform to Islam. I mean, a very obvious one is just the idea that women need to be passive, quiet, you know, not really dominant in kind of a sphere kind of outside of their home, that, you know, the public sphere is off limits to them. All of those things, sometimes when you actually look back and think that, okay, these things are not something that was prescribed Islamically for women, even something like haya, which obviously is a huge part of what we as women should embody. The best example that we have of haya is actually a man. It's Uthman radiallahu anh. So I think sometimes reconsidering some of these things can help us to deconstruct the assumptions that we have about how women should be versus how men should be. And really, again, yeah, like Sarah said, go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and take our kind of baseline from there.
Yeah, definitely. And even in terms of, I guess, one thing I also wanted to add is that I don't know if it's a common thing, but I would say like you brought up a good point, Aisha, in terms of it seems like cliched, but listening to Muslim women and listening in terms of like trying to understand, and it'll sound like a sort of leftist, but you know, experience does matter, right? That's how literally, you know, different people experience society in different ways, right? And like there is certain privileges people sound like a total leftist, but anyways, like privilege, it does exist to a degree, right? Whether you want to define it different ways or not. And at times, like what happens, I guess, you know, I don't know, Muslim men may want to at times may shun the experiences of Muslim women because, I don't know, like in the default in the mind it might pop up like, oh, they're probably a bit too emotional and seeing things a bit too pessimistically, therefore like I tend to, you know, see it more objectively, so I have a more of a better take on this opinion, for example. Like those kind of like subconscious maybe things at times that plays in the way we interact. So it's about like really listening and learning and understanding, right? So that's sort of my sort of take on that. But did you have any sort of thoughts to add to that? Because I do want to ask like one or two random questions before we wrap up. But
no, I think we're good, alhamdulillah. Like you said, I think it's all just about, exposing ourselves to new ideas and being open and confident that, you know, we don't need to be scared. Like, we have wahi on our side. Like, we have the truth. Inshallah, it will be enough to, like, counter things that are problematic. We can engage with it. And if it forces us to kind of challenge ourselves and find new ways of addressing issues, then that's all positive. That's all fi sabilillah.
Sarah, did you have any sort of final thoughts?
No, I'm just nodding at the last 2 points that y'all made. I think if anybody is skeptical of, you know, whether this whole like listening to women point has any substance, just again, like revisit the Sunnah, look at how the Prophet ﷺ interacted with the women around him and also with people around him in general. I don't know what image people have of the Prophet ﷺ in their heads, but he was actually somebody who was spent most of his time silent and listening in gatherings. Obviously, he had more knowledge and more emotional intelligence than anybody there. But why then did he spend so much time listening to other people? Why do we read about him in the Shama'il as like turning his whole body to a person when that person begins speaking and like giving them his full attention? What can he learn from other people that he doesn't already know, that he's not receiving from wahi? And is he not, you know, like, I don't know, like just reading about the Prophet ﷺ's relationship with Aisha is like, it's so interesting and like such a beautiful example of, you know, like a healthy relationship. And it's not, we don't have a shortage of like role models, you know, in the Prophet ﷺ himself and in his companions. May Allah be pleased with them. So may Allah give us tawfiq to actually emulate them.
I mean, and I'm very sure Rasulullah ﷺ didn't, you know, do surveys in the haram when it comes to who wants second wives. So these kind of things, like, I guess it's really weird how it's kind of normalized as well in this sort of day and age. I wanted to quickly ask, I know it's a random topic, but your thoughts on Muslim Twitter in general. Like,
oh God.
I've had this because I had this kind of conversation in other podcasts where because a lot of people, like a lot of figures on the platform will say, like, you know, it's a cesspool and this and that, and they probably get takfired and all that sort of stuff. But for me, I take a different approach. I think there's a lot of brilliant thinkers and stuff like that, so I tend to just try to take in what they're saying. So I wanted to get your thoughts on Muslim Twitter in general.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, subhanAllah, there's benefit to be found everywhere. And I think social media has, I mean, even since it's the internet's creation, like, what has it done? It's made a place of belonging for people who couldn't find like-minded individuals around them physically, so it connected them digitally. And you know, I've met so many amazing people, mashallah, through Twitter. I didn't know Sarah before, to be honest, but I knew several other people in our circle through social media when we did initially meet. And then I've met so many other people since then. And subhanAllah, I feel like sometimes it feels actually like not Muslim Twitter is an extension of your community, but you know people either from real life as well, and then you kind of have friends of friends, and then when something happens, me and Sarah are, you know, an ocean apart, but sometimes we'll be talking about things literally as though we're in the same community because it happened and we're both seeing it and we both know everybody involved. And there's definitely negative to that, but there's also positives, and it's a great source of knowledge for people who don't treat it as their source of knowledge. And I know that sounds very contradictory, but it's a great exposure to the different kinds of perspectives out there, but you can't treat that as an absolute source of they said this, therefore this is the right way. It's more like a kind of a springboard for you to, okay, here, oh, somebody said that, I've never heard about that aspect before. You read up, you learn about it, you listen to shuyukh on the topic if relevant, and then you start to understand where different people are coming from and things like that. So I think there's always benefit to be found in these situations, but obviously as well, like all situations, you know, you have to be careful of letting your nafs dominate and lead to kind of problematic interactions. And definitely just the digital sphere is particularly, it's not immune to that by any stretch of the imagination. It's particularly susceptible to it. So I think it's, something always kind of to be careful of. And I think, again, just echoing kind of Sarah's last point, actually, about listening rather than speaking. Social media has given a voice to everyone, but that doesn't mean we need to give an opinion on everything. And we should always be willing to say. However, I just think that it is important to remember that obviously social media can be a place where the nafs, if not restrained, can kind of run riot a little bit. And we need to kind of remember that obviously we're always going to be accountable for what we say. And just because we have the means to say it doesn't mean we have to say it. And I think Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it is a story about Imam Malik, where a man had traveled from far to ask, you know, him questions as an extremely well-renowned scholar of Islam. And he asked about kind of, I think it was 35 questions or 37 questions. And to 30 of them, Imam Malik responded with, I don't know. And this man was like, I came all this way because I heard that you're so knowledgeable, and why are you answering most of my questions with, I don't know? But Imam Malik was just that, you know, how can I have this, claim the authority to speak on behalf of Allah and His Messenger if I'm not absolutely sure? And I think sometimes that's just a lesson that, you know, to myself first and foremost, that we all need to remember to, speak with caution and, not claim expertise unduly.
Yeah, I mean, Muslim Twitter, like, it could be worse. It could be Reddit. At least it's not that bad. And it's, you know, it is what you make of it. Like, you can choose to follow certain people. You can choose to engage in productive conversations, or you can choose to, like, go after the people you hate. And it's ironically the people who are, like, always complaining about it being a cesspool who, like, find and go after those people and, like, those viewpoints that they really disagree with. I think, like, you know, it should not take up like a huge, social media in general should not take a huge portion of your time. Seeking knowledge from, like, you know, in a really systematic, logical way that follows, you know, a logical curriculum should be your priority. And then, you know, socializing with people, there's no problem with that. But if you know that you don't have like a solid foundation in Islam, and then you allow yourself to be exposed to a lot of like really terrible viewpoints, like the hottest takes imaginable, you know, you kind of have to take responsibility for that, you know, weakening of your own iman, or the effect that it has on you spiritually. But it's very easy to, you know, like take the good and leave the bad. And to, as you know, as much as we say that, like, you know, the online world is not the real world and we have to remain grounded in the real world, the online sphere has a lot of benefits that translate to the real world. We've met a lot of cool people there. We're able to organize with people who we've met online. So there's a lot of benefit to it, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, there's generally like a lot of benefit in terms of how you use a platform. And I guess if you use it for a sort of means in terms of, I guess, like for you guys, how you started up Qarawiyyin Project would have been, through the help of essentially Muslim Twitter as well. You can kind of choose to use a platform in a way. So I guess it sort of boils down to that as well. But I guess because nearing the end of our episode, I wanted to sort of, if you have any sort of final thoughts in general in terms of any of the stuff we discussed, or any sort of things that you'd like to highlight before I ask you sort of the last question we always ask to our guests. So probably Aisha, I guess, if you have any sort of final thoughts in regards to anything we talked about, or anything you feel that the conversation should continue, and maybe in terms of what Qarawiyyin Project do, or are looking to do in terms of future vision and projects.
No, nothing kind of super specific. Alhamdulillah, thank you again, for having us on, and it's been a really interesting conversation. And may Allah forgive us if anything we've said has not been correct. But yeah, in terms of Qarawiyyin Project, inshallah, we have some upcoming articles and podcast content as well that we're excited to share with everybody. And we're definitely as well always open to contributions, again, specifically to sisters at the present time. But, if people and Muslim women feel like they have issues that they want to speak about either themselves, or they would like to see other members of our team cover, then we would really, really love people to get in touch with us. And yeah, inshallah, you can find our details on kind of our social media accounts and our website, which is qarawiyyinproject.co. And yeah, alhamdulillah, inshallah, it would be really good to sort of have people take part in that discussion. We do have readership from Australia, but it could be bigger. I think UK and US still dominate. So inshallah, this will be getting out to people, to some of your listeners for the first time. So it'll be exciting, inshallah, see the response.
Inshallah, yeah. I would just add that my recommendation to people when it comes to making use of the Qarawiyyin Project as a platform is one, please contribute, but also see it as maybe a launching pad to seeking further knowledge. So as much as we put out our own content, we also try to direct people towards one, reading actual books. So that's why we share a lot of book lists, because we hope people to engage in a more substantial form of seeking knowledge, rather than just listening to things or reading short articles or engaging in social media conversations. But also check out the resource bank that's on the website, which so far we've only included free online resources that people can use to seek Islamic knowledge, with the caveat that it's not a replacement for, an Alimiya program. It's just, resources for people who need them. And yeah, if you have recommendations for resources to add to that as well, please message us and let us know, inshallah.
So yeah, definitely check out the website and articles, and I guess as a reminder for Australian listeners, make sure you check out the website, inshallah, to get the viewership up from Australia. But I guess I'll ask the final question. We asked this question to all our guests. You may have heard of it. It's the infamous, if you wanted to chill with three people in a cave, because boys in the cave, who would you chill with? They can be anyone from the past, or anyone currently living, and essentially they can also they can't be Rasulullah or the Sahaba or the prophets, because everyone's gonna kind of pick them, and we want sort of a diverse sort of answers. And I guess we can assume they're already in the cave, but who else would you want to hang with? Three people.
I mean, you say, Tanzim, if we've heard of this question. This is actually a question I really liked the first time I listened to a Boys in the Cave podcast. And Sarah will attest to this, that I've given a lot of thought to this even before this podcast episode. It's something I think is a really question that's indicative of people's personalities and their interests. So when you said that we were going to come on, I was like, finally, I get to say my choices. But obviously, there's so many people, so I don't feel like this is, a comprehensive list of amazing people from history at all. But I guess three people that, inshallah, I would be honored to speak with would be, so first, Fatima al-Fihri, who is obviously the founder of Al-Qarawiyyin Masjid, and she is, and that masjid is obviously what we've named the Qarawiyyin Project after. She was, mashallah, an amazing woman of immense spirituality, and she actually fasted for the duration of the time that the mosque was being built, and she'd used money from her inheritance in order to make this masjid. And it was something that she wanted to serve her community and for later generations as well. And the fact that, subhanAllah, later on this masjid was turned into a university and is one of the oldest degree granting universities in the world, I think is really just a testament to her sincerity. So she's number one. Number 2 is Shaykh al-Islam, rahimahullah, Ibn Taymiyyah, because I think his work is just something is really, really fascinating, and I've really enjoyed reading about his take on issues of his time, but also their relevance for today. And I think he's often misconstrued, but he has some really, really incisive points, particularly about things like governance and sovereignty and, Allah's sovereignty in that respect. And then lastly, it's another Muslim woman. It's Zainab al-Ghazali, who was an Egyptian activist with the Muslim Brotherhood in the 50s and 60s. And her life is just really, subhanAllah, so incredible. She started a magazine and a group when she was just 18 years old, to basically, as part of kind of the revivalist movements that were happening at the time, in terms of calling for the re-establishment of Islam. But she was somebody who, it's ironic actually in kind of the whole discussion on feminism, because she really kind of confuses, I feel, modern day scholars, because she's somebody who was extremely vocal, and she used to give talks where thousands of people in Egypt, thousands of Muslim women would come and attend. But at the same time, she was very staunch in her defense of the Sharia and Islam and the position that Islam gives women. So they call her an Islamist feminist, which I just think is a hilarious kind of oxymoron to try and define her with. And she was imprisoned under the Nasser regime, and she was tortured. She saw dreams of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She wrote 2 books, and she retained her independence from kind of other movements at the time, although obviously she was kind of affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood. So, I mean, I don't want to give her whole life story, but she, mashallah, is a real inspiration of what it means for Muslim women in the modern period to play an active role in society. So those are my 3.
Yeah. Good thing we came prepared, because like we were talking about this before, and all the people that Aisha mentioned were people that I had considered, and I would have to visit your cave because it sounds pretty lit. But in terms of 3 people that I would like to speak with, first one being Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, rahimahullah ta'ala, who's like a very well known like a waliya of Allah, who she's labeled as like a Sufi mystic, a Sufi saint. But really what I think is amazing about her is like, and also learning about her was the first time that I had been introduced to this idea, but she's very much associated with the idea of like the purpose of life being seeking Allah, not seeking Jannah or seeking to be saved from Jahannam, but that the like utmost sincerity that you can have in your ibadah is to do it purely for the sake of Allah, and to not even be thinking about like reward or punishment, which is like it that's not even the standard that the Prophet ﷺ said that we have to hold ourselves to, but it's kind of like a step above that, and like it's just like a really stellar and like something to look up to, is something to aspire to. And second one would be Sayyid Qutb, rahimahullah, who actually, the anniversary of his passing was, I think, quite recent. So he's been on my mind, and it's very unfortunate like how much his legacy has been misconstrued. But I think there's, it's incumbent on Muslims to kind of like try to reclaim it and like learn about him, and like read his works as he intended them. There's so much to gain from him and his writings, and even his like his tafsir of fi Lilal al-Quran, in the shade of the Quran. The first time I like really read Surah An-Nisa like in English, and then like read his tafsir of it in English, like it was just very powerful for me, and I think all sisters should engage in that process and should really dive into that surah. And the last person would be Muna Abul Fadl, who's also passed away, rahimahullah, who's really an incredible academic who's like, she's associated with like IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which was founded in North America by like Ismail Farouqi and a few other scholars, like I think mid-20th century or late 20th century. It has now like really expanded globally. But Muna Abul Fadl, like I've read like a couple of her works, and it's like there are people who write in a really complicated way just to be pedantic, but reading her work, I'm like, she's actually this smart. Like this isn't just how her brain works. Like she just thinks in like, on another level, and her ideas are complex because they need to be. And just like the way that she, in like her book, I think the title is Where East Meets West, or Between East and West. But she talks about, like us as Muslims studying the West and how we should study the West. And then, like how this whole project that I think, IIIT is also associated with, which is like the Islamization of knowledge. It's just incredibly interesting. And like, it would have been amazing to meet her. So inshallah, we can meet all of them in Jannah.
MashaAllah, very comprehensive sort of breakdown with why you have certain figures in the cave, because usually when I have guests on, they take like 5 minutes to think about it, and you're kind of editing it for you got to remove those 5 minutes of silence to sort of, because the sort of, I didn't expect that question. So, alhamdulillah, it's a good change in terms of having a full comprehensive breakdown. So, MashaAllah. So, for, I guess, what sort of links, I'll actually drop some of the links to Qarawiyyin Project in our show notes, inshallah. But if our listeners wanted to follow you guys in, I don't know, social media or anywhere else, where can they find you specifically?
Yeah, so the main website where we post all of our articles and podcast episodes is qarawiyyinproject.co. And then we're active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. On Facebook, we're the Qarawiyyin Project. And then on Twitter and Instagram, it's at Qarawiyyin Proj, because there's a character limit on Twitter handles. But yeah, so, and then if, you'll find links to the Qarawiyyin podcast on the website, but if you want to just like, go find, the list of platforms that it's available on, you can just go straight to anchor.fm/Qarawiyyin-podcast. It's on like typical platforms like, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean. But yeah, that's where we're at.
And your sort of personal social medias, in terms of if people wanted to know your sort of personal kind of works or tweets in general.
Yeah, I'm only really active on Twitter, but my handle is Betul, but it's like BET0ULE. So yeah, if you go to the Qarawiyyin Project account, and like you'll find it retweeting me. Probably the easiest way to find it.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably more priority is for people to follow Qarawiyyin Project account than myself. But if people really wanted to contact me, then it's at Sharia Aisha. And yeah, that's already, I think, Twitter is probably the easiest way to get to me as well.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll drop all those links in the show notes, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair to both of you for coming on Boys in the Cave. It was a really fascinating discussion. I really took in a lot at the beginning, and I had, a lot of sort of light bulb moments in terms of, I guess, the sort of differences in the way we approach things as well in the West, in being in different contexts, and also I'm talking about feminism. And I guess also for the audience, like, I didn't just kick out Ryma randomly. We're not, patriarchal in the Boys in the Cave. She actually has work and she had to leave, so I just took over when she sort of left. So just wanted to make that clear. But Jazakallah khair to both of you to coming on Boys in the Cave. It was really a good discussion, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com, or find us on Facebook, and you can follow our journey through Instagram. Follow us on Patreon. Sign up, inshallah. We've got a WhatsApp group. It's got a lot of big figures, alhamdulillah. A lot of our guests like Dr. Jonathan Brown, Asadullah Ali, Muhammad Taba, many other people as well, Sheikh Omar Boloch, and a lot of figures that are in that WhatsApp group. So you can definitely check that and find out how you can get onto that WhatsApp group. So if you just go on patreon.com, it's a $5 entire monthly account, and then you just literally, I'll add you into the chat, inshallah. So for our special guest, Aisha and Sarah, and my co-host Ryma and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.